That night, under Colorado's starry sky, Shadow, the old dog, dragged his bleeding body toward little Lily's cries from the fox den. He growled, "Touch her, and I'll kill you." Amid the skin-cutting blizzard, only his golden eyes burned. The eyes of a warrior ready to die to protect his family. Subscribe now to watch our next heart-stirring films. Lucas Parker woke before dawn, as he always did, even though the war had ended almost a decade ago. He lay in bed listening to the winter wind rattle the window panes, the sound mingling with the soft breathing of his 4-year-old daughter Lily in the adjacent room. For a long moment, he just stared at the ceiling, his mind quiet and heavy in that familiar way, like a pond frozen over with ice too thick to break, no matter how brightly the sun burned. The house was silent, except for the groan of old wooden beams settling against the cold. Beside his bed sat a framed photo Lucas in fatigue's arms slung over another seal's shoulder, both men squinting against the Afghanistan sun. Shadow was in the photo too, ears perked, tongue out, looking directly into the camera, with a singular intensity only a Malinois possessed. That had been 5 years ago, before Shadow's injury. Before Lucas's wife died, before the world condensed into a cabin tucked between Colorado's towering evergreens and a child too small to understand how grief could hollow a man from the inside out. Lucas swung his legs over the side of the bed, the hardwood icy against his bare feet. He dressed in silence, dark jeans, thermal Henley flannel overshirt, socks thick enough to ward off frostbite. His movements were economical, efficient, honed by years of discipline and necessity. Even now, long removed from active service, his muscles remembered what his mind sometimes tried to forget: speed could mean survival. In the living room, dawn seeped through frost-laced windows, illuminating dust motes that floated like ghosts in the thin golden light. The fireplace still held a faint glow from last night's embers. On the braided rug lay Shadow, curled tight, head resting on his front paws, eyes half open. His ears twitched as Lucas entered, though he didn't lift his head. One hind leg stuck out at an awkward angle, the muscle around his hip, slightly wasted from injury. A pink scar curled across his thigh, half hidden beneath dark fur. "Morning, soldier," Lucas murmured. Shadow's tail thumped once against the rug in response. He tried to rise, shifting his weight forward, but his injured leg trembled under him. With a low grunt, he sat back down, ears flattening with frustration. Lucas crossed the room, kneeling beside him, resting a roughened hand on Shadow's broad head. The dog pressed into his palm, eyes closing in a moment of relief and recognition. "You're good, buddy," Lucas said softly. "You're still the best damn thing this family's got." From the hallway came the sound of tiny feet pattering across the wood floor. Lily appeared, hair a wild halo of blonde curls, her pink fleece pajamas adorned with faded cartoon penguins. She clutched a small plush fox in one arm. Her cheeks glowed warm from sleep, and her blue eyes widened when she saw Shadow. "Shadow," she squealed, dropping the fox and racing across the room. She threw her arms around the dog's neck, pressing her face against his fur. Shadow let out a deep, rumbling sigh and licked her cheek ears, pricking forward in pure devotion. For a moment, Lucas let himself watch them without thinking of his wife, without seeing Emily's smile in Lily's curved lips or hearing her voice in Lily's excited squeals. He simply watched his daughter with her dog, letting the sight carve out a small space in his chest where peace could live, even if just for seconds. "Did Shadow sleep good?" Daddy Lily asked, turning her bright gaze up at him. "He did," Lucas lied. Shadow had whimpered half the night, shifting and licking the scar tissue that flared with arthritis in the cold. But Lily didn't need to know about pain, not yet. "And now he wants breakfast." "You hungry too, Bug?" She nodded enthusiastically, curls bouncing, and ran toward the kitchen. Lucas scratched Shadow behind the ears. "Come on, big guy," he murmured. Shadow heaved himself upright, his back leg dragging slightly as he followed Lucas and Lily. Outside the kitchen window, the Colorado wilderness stretched wide and endless. Towering ponderosa pines lined the ridge beyond their property, their trunks black against dawn's pinkening sky. Snow lay in thick, unbroken drifts, turning the world white and silent. Tiny ice crystals sparkled on every branch, catching the early sun in brief, dazzling flares. The window over the sink framed the distant peaks of the San Juan Mountains, their jagged crests inked blue against the awakening horizon. Lucas watched Lily climb onto her stool and pour cereal into her plastic bowl, humming to herself. Shadow lay down at her feet, chin resting on crossed paws, dark eyes watching her with unwavering focus. Every so often, his ears flicked back toward the window, alert even in rest, as if listening for threats only he could sense. Lucas set water to boil for coffee. The kettle hissed quietly, steam curling up in ghostly ribbons. He closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of pine smoke lingering from the fireplace, and allowed himself to feel the exhaustion that settled in his bones each morning. Another day alive. Another day to keep Lily safe. Another day to remind Shadow that even broken warriors still had worth. Daddy, Lily said, interrupting his thoughts. Can we go outside later? I want to show Shadow my snow angel. Lucas glanced outside at the swirling gusts sweeping powder across the yard. The wind howled low and mournful between the trees, carrying with it a cold sharp enough to steal breath. He hesitated. Maybe later, Bug, he said. When the sun's higher. She pouted, poking at her cereal with the spoon. But Shadow loves playing in the snow. He's a snow doggy. Lucas smiled faintly. Yeah, he is. He poured coffee into a chipped enamel mug and turned away from the window, unwilling to look too long at the endless wilderness pressing against their little cabin. Out there lay memories he couldn't bury and dangers he couldn't predict. Out there lay the past that refused to let him go. Shadow shifted, trying to get comfortable on the kitchen tile. His legs splayed at an unnatural angle, and he whined softly, licking the joint where pink ropey scar tissue puckered against wiry fur. Lucas crouched down, pressing his forehead against Shadow's. The dog went still, only his chest rising and falling, eyes closed. You're okay, buddy, Lucas whispered. You're here. She needs you. I need you. Shadow opened his eyes, gazing at him with an intelligence that was more than instinct. In those dark depths lived memories of helicopter rotors thrumming over Afghan mountains, the sharp tang of explosives, the screams of men torn apart by shrapnel. In those eyes lived loyalty beyond words and pain deeper than scars. Daddy, Shadow's sad, Lily said softly. Lucas turned to her. She had climbed down from her stool and now stood with her little hand resting on Shadow's head, tiny fingers threaded into his short fur. Her eyes were solemn too, knowing for a 4-year-old. She stroked Shadow gently. Don't be sad, Shadow, she whispered. I'll always love you. Shadow thumped his tail once against the floor and pressed his head into her small chest. For a moment, Lucas saw the old Shadow, the unbreakable K9, who detected IEDs miles away, who'd pulled wounded soldiers from burning Humvees, who'd saved Lucas's life more times than he could count. For a moment, the dog looked powerful again. Whole. Invincible. Then he shifted, and his injured legs skidded on the slick tile. He let out a soft yelp and lay back down, panting from the exertion. Lucas stood scrubbing a hand over his beard. His fingers trembled slightly, and he clenched them into a fist until the shaking stopped. He glanced out the window again. Snow fell faster now, thickening the already heavy drifts, obscuring the shapes of trees into amorphous white silhouettes. It would be a brutal day for travel, dangerous for any creature caught in its grip. Daddy, Lily said, her voice small. Will Mommy see my snow angel today? Lucas swallowed hard, throat tightening. Yeah, Bug, he whispered. Yeah, she will. Lily smiled and turned back to Shadow. The dog watched her with dark, liquid eyes, his ears flicking forward at every sound she made. Outside, the wind screamed down from the mountains, rattling the window panes, shaking the cabin's frame. But inside, for a moment, there was only warmth, a father, his daughter, and the dog who would die before letting anything hurt her. Shadow shifted again, wincing as his hip caught on the floorboards. His breath quickened, nostrils flaring. Then he exhaled slowly, relaxing, as Lily buried her face in his fur, humming a tuneless little song that only she understood. Lucas watched them from the kitchen, sipping his coffee, letting the heat burn down his throat and settle into his chest, trying to thaw the parts of him that had frozen long before winter arrived. Daddy, Lily said suddenly, looking up with wide eyes. When I grow up, I want to be like Shadow. Lucas raised a brow. Like Shadow, she nodded earnestly. Brave and strong, and always protecting people. Shadow's tail thumped again at her words, as if he understood and approved. Lucas blinked against the sting rising behind his eyes. He looked away, focusing on the swirling snow outside the dark tree trunks, standing sentinel against the dawn. Yeah, Bug, he said softly. That's a good thing to be. Outside, the world was cold and silent and dangerous. But inside their little cabin, love burned warm, fierce, and unbreakable. A father, a daughter, and a wounded warrior with 4 legs and a heart bigger than the mountains. After breakfast, Lucas rinsed Lily's cereal bowl in the sink, the hot water steaming against the morning chill that seeped through the kitchen window panes. Outside, snow still fell in silent curtains, blanketing the yard and burying the rickety fence that bordered the forest beyond. Shadow lay by the wood stove, chin resting on his paws, eyes half closed. But his ears flicked every so often at the whispering gusts that pressed against the cabin walls. Daddy, Lily said, hopping down from her stool and dragging her plush fox by the tail. Can Shadow come with me when I'm a princess today? Lucas wiped his hands on a dish towel. Shadow would love that, he said. But how about before you start ruling your kingdom, we tell a story first? Her eyes widened. One of the war stories. He hesitated. These were not stories meant for children for hearts so small and soft. But her mother used to say that darkness wasn't what broke people. It was facing darkness alone. He reached down and scooped her into his arms. She squealed and wrapped her arms around his neck, her curls brushing against his cheek. He carried her to the worn leather recliner near the fireplace and settled her onto his lap. Shadow raised his head, his eyes meeting Lucas's with quiet understanding. Then he shifted onto his side with a grunt and stretched his good front paw toward them, as if reaching to be included in whatever was coming next. "Is it a shadow story?" Lily asked, bouncing slightly on his knee. "Yeah," Lucas said softly. "It's a shadow story." She clapped her hands in delight. "Tell me." He leaned back, staring into the wavering orange glow of the fire. For a moment, he was no longer in a warm cabin in Colorado. He was back under a sky so hot, it bleached everything to bone white, the sand burning through his boots, the smell of diesel cordite, and sweat thick in his nose. The rhythmic chop of helicopter blades overhead, the taste of adrenaline like copper pennies on his tongue. It was in Afghanistan. He began his voice low, the words vibrating through Lily's small frame. "I was with my team Bravo 6. We'd been sent out past Helmand Province to intercept a weapons convoy. Shadow was there too. He was younger then, strong, fearless, fast as lightning." He felt her little hands clutch his flannel shirt tighter. Shadow's tail thumped once against the floor, his eyes watching Lucas with a depth that spoke of memory. "We set up an ambush," Lucas continued. But something felt wrong. Shadow kept sniffing the air, pacing, growling low. His handler, Sergeant Price, told him to settle, but Shadow wouldn't listen. Lily's gaze was wide blue eyes glowing in the firelight. "What was wrong, Daddy?" Lucas swallowed, feeling his pulse hammer in his throat. He smelled explosives. There was an IED buried under the sand right where I was kneeling, setting up overwatch. If Shadow hadn't pulled me back, grabbed my vest harness in his teeth, and yanked with everything he had, I wouldn't be here. Shadow shifted again, as if embarrassed by the attention, and rested his head on his front paws, eyes half-lidded, but watching them both. Lily reached out a tiny hand and stroked Shadow's scarred flank. "You saved my daddy," she whispered. Shadow's ear flicked his breathing steady. The room was silent, except for the pop and hiss of the firewood. "He didn't just save me that day," Lucas said, his voice rough. "He saved a lot of men, a lot of fathers and sons. Shadow's knows. It's like a superpower. He can smell death before it comes." Lily looked at Shadow with awe, as if seeing him for the first time. "He's my superhero, doggy." "Yeah," Lucas said softly. "He is." She leaned over and pressed a kiss to Shadow's muzzle. The dog let out a low, contented sigh, eyes fluttering closed. "Tell me more, Daddy," she said sleepily. "Tell me another Shadow story." He brushed her curls back from her forehead, his chest tight. "There are too many, Bug. Too many stories of Shadow being brave. But there's one thing you should know about him." What she asked, her voice drifting as sleep began to tug at her. "He's the last gift your mama gave us," he whispered. Lily's breathing slowed, her thumb finding her mouth as her eyelids drooped. Shadow shifted closer to the recliner, his body moving stiffly, and rested his head on Lucas's boot. His dark eyes looked up at Lucas, and in them, he saw questions. Doubts. Pain. But also devotion so fierce, it burned. Lucas reached down and scratched behind Shadow's ear. "You're the last thing she picked for us before she died," he murmured. "May là món quà cuối cùng Lily có được từ mẹ nó." Shadow closed his eyes, leaning into the touch. Outside, the snow fell harder, thickening into a storm that swept across the valley, obliterating the pines into vague smudges of gray and white. Wind screamed around the eaves, rattling loose shingles, testing the edges of their fragile world. Inside, the fire flickered warm. Lily slept curled in her father's arms, her cheek pressed against his chest. Tiny fingers still twisted into his shirt. Shadow dozed at their feet, his chest rising and falling, ears twitching each time the wind howled too loud or the cabin creaked too long. Later that evening, after Lily had woken and eaten her dinner, macaroni from a box with pieces of hot dog cut into crescent moons, she fell asleep again on the couch. Lucas sat across from her, rubbing liniment into Shadow's injured hip. The dog's fur was speckled with gray now, and his leg muscles had thinned around the old bullet wound. He winced slightly as Lucas massaged deeper into the joint. "Sorry, buddy," Lucas said. Shadow turned and licked his wrist, as if to say he understood. When he finished, Lucas sat back on his heels. The room was dim, except for the glow of the fire, and the small lamp on the end table illuminating Lily's sleeping form. She lay with her legs tucked under her cheek, pressed against Shadow's ribs. One small hand lay across his broad chest, rising and falling with each of his breaths. Her curls splayed across his fur like strands of spun gold, catching the light glowing in the quiet. Shadow opened his eyes, turning his head to look at Lucas. There was something in his gaze tonight, an unease that made Lucas's stomach tighten. The dog's ears pricked forward, and he sniffed the air, his nostrils flaring slightly. Then he turned his gaze to the window, where, beyond the glass, only darkness and swirling snow existed. Lucas felt a cold tendril slip down his spine. He rose and crossed the room, looking out into the blackness. The yard light illuminated thick flakes sweeping past in horizontal gusts, the fence barely visible, the tree line gone entirely. Nothing moved out there, but Shadow continued to stare ears forward, eyes locked onto something unseen. "Hey," Lucas said quietly, walking back to him. He knelt beside the dog, rubbing his chest. "It's okay, Shadow. Just the storm." But Shadow's gaze didn't leave the window. He shifted, licking Lily's small hand where it rested on his chest, then turned his eyes back to the darkness beyond the glass. A soft growl rumbled in his throat, low, quiet, questioning rather than threatening. His tail lay flat, unmoving. Lucas frowned, the back of his neck prickling. He looked down at Lily, blissfully asleep, her breath slow and even. He brushed a curl from her cheek, feeling the warmth of her skin against his rough fingers. Then he looked back at Shadow, whose eyes had softened, though his ears remained pricked. "What is it?" Bud, Lucas whispered. "What do you see out there?" Shadow blinked slowly and let out a long sigh, laying his head down on the couch cushion near Lily's hand. But his ears remained forward, his body tense even in rest, as if bracing for something he could sense, but could not name. Lucas settled back onto his heels, resting his hands on his thighs. Outside, the storm howled louder wind, lashing against the cabin walls. The wood stove crackled, casting fleeting shadows that danced across Shadow's face. In those shifting lines of light and dark, Lucas saw what he'd always seen in the dog, a protector forged by violence, scarred by sacrifice, held together by love alone. Shadow licked Lily's hand again, then closed his eyes. But even as sleep pulled at him, his ears twitched at every creak, every gust rattling the window, every whisper of snow sweeping across the roof. The storm raged, the cabin groaned, and the little girl slept peacefully against the only creature in the world who would die before letting harm come to her. Lucas sat beside them, silent, feeling the heaviness gather in his chest. He did not know why Shadow was uneasy tonight, but he knew this: if darkness came for them, it would have to face the full fury of a warrior and his dog before it ever reached the child. Outside, the storm roared on, white and endless and indifferent. Inside, love burned low and fierce, a dying fire that could not be snuffed out, no matter how the wind screamed or how the shadows pressed against the thin wooden walls of their fragile world. The cabin smelled of garlic and rosemary that evening. Lucas stood at the stove, stirring a cast-iron pan filled with searing venison steaks, the meat sizzling in browned butter and herbs. Outside, night pressed hard against the windows. Wind howled through the pine forest, rattling the eaves and moaning down the chimney like a mournful spirit. The wood stove burned hot in the living room, flames dancing behind its soot-streaked glass. Shadow lay curled on his side near the hearth, his injured leg tucked awkwardly against his belly. Every so often, he twitched a small, involuntary spasm that made him grunt softly in pain. He shifted, resting his chin on his paws, and stared across the room with heavy, half-lidded eyes. The old scar on his hip throbbed in time with the pulse of aching bone. Lucas flipped the steaks and sprinkled salt over the browned crusts. Behind him, Lily chattered away to herself. She was in the mudroom at the back of the house, pulling on her little green boots with frogs printed across the toes. Her voice carried into the kitchen sweet and lilting as she sang nonsense songs about princesses and foxes and snowflake kingdoms. Every now and then he heard the squeak of the back door as she peeked outside, giggling at the whirling snowflakes that tumbled past the porch light. "Stay where I can see you, Bug," he called over his shoulder, not taking his eyes off the pan. "Okay, Daddy," she yelled back, her voice muffled as she shoved her head through her pink fleece hat. Then came the sound of the back door creaking open, the sudden rush of frigid air sweeping into the cabin. Lucas shivered as the cold slapped against his bare forearms, goosebumps rising under the flannel. Shadow lifted his head, ears flicking forward. His nose twitched as he scented the draft nostrils, flaring slightly. A low whine rumbled in his throat as he watched Lily's small shadow dart across the porch. "Shadow, keep an eye on her," Lucas said absently, turning back to the stove. He basted the steaks with bubbling butter, watching the edges curl and crisp. Steam fogged up the kitchen window, obscuring the dark world beyond into a shifting smear of shadows and light. Shadow's eyes followed Lily's silhouette as she stepped into the snow. Her boots sank deep into the drifts, nearly up to her knees. She squealed in delight and flopped backward, making a snow angel, her arms sweeping side to side in wide arcs. The porch light haloed her in gold flakes, swirling around her like tiny shards of glass. Inside, the clock ticked above the pantry door. Lucas plated the steaks and covered them with foil to rest. He scrubbed his hands at the sink, staring out at the window, but seeing only his own reflection, a man with eyes too tired for 38 lines, etched deep across his forehead beard, flecked with gray. Beyond the glass, snow fell heavy and unbroken, erasing the world into whiteness. "Lily, come wash up," he called, drying his hands on a dish towel. No answer. "Bug," he said louder, stepping to the mudroom door. He saw her small boots lined up neatly on the mat. Frowning, he glanced out the back window, expecting to see her rolling snowballs or digging tunnels in the drifts. The yard was empty, the porch light illuminating nothing but swirling white. "Lily?" His voice rose tight with sudden unease. Still no answer. He stepped onto the porch, the cold hitting him like a slap. Snow whipped against his face, tiny needles biting into his cheeks and eyelids. He scanned the yard, heart-hammering. The drifts were deep and smooth, unbroken by footprints. Only the vague impression of where she'd made her snow angel remained, already half filled with drifting powder. "Lily," he shouted, voice cracking with panic. The forest swallowed his cry, the howling wind shredding his words and scattering them into the darkness. Inside, Shadow stirred. His ears pricked forward, hackles rising along his spine. He lifted his head, blinking against the dim lamplight, and sniffed the air. A deep tremor shivered through his frame. Slowly, he pushed himself upright, his injured leg dragging as he stood. Pain shot through his hip like hot wire, and he let out a low, pained grunt. But something in Lucas's voice cut through the fog of old injuries and age. The tone wasn't casual, wasn't commanding. It was raw, desperate, tinged with fear. Shadow hadn't heard since their last mission in Helmand Province. The dog shook himself, once ears flicking, and hobbled toward the mudroom. The tiles were slick under his paws, and his legs slipped, sending a jolt of pain shooting up his side. He growled softly at his own weakness, forcing himself forward. From the porch, Lucas's voice rose again, slicing through the winter night like a blade. "Lily, answer me, baby girl." Shadow reached the doorway. His vision blurred for a moment from pain, then cleared. Through the open door, the porch light cast a pool of gold onto the snow. Lucas stood at the top step, head turning side to side in frantic jerks. His breath steamed out in short, ragged bursts. Beyond him, the yard stretched white and empty. The swirling snow reflected the porch light back in endless waves, obscuring everything into a whirling vortex of ice and wind. Shadow blinked, focusing past the light, his pupils dilating. He scented the air, nostrils flaring wide. Underneath the cold, underneath the smoke from Lucas's clothes, he caught at the faintest trace of Lily's scent mingled with something else. Something wrong. Something unfamiliar. He let out a sharp, rising bark that turned into a howl, long, piercing, desperate. The sound cut through the storm, echoing across the yard, rolling into the black line of trees beyond the fence. It was not just a call. It was a cry of warning, a cry of alarm, a cry of rage. Lucas turned sharply at the howl. His eyes locked on Shadow, standing in the doorway, chest heaving, tail raised, hackles stiff along his spine. The dog's lips curled back slightly, showing the edges of his teeth as he sniffed the air again and let out another deep, guttural growl. "Where is she?" Lucas demanded, his voice hoarse. He vaulted down the steps into the snow boots, sinking up to his calves. He turned in circles, scanning the yard, the porch light behind him casting his shadow long and flickering across the drifts. "Lily," he roared into the wind. Nothing. Only the hiss of snow sweeping across the frozen ground, the sigh of pine boughs bending under their icy burdens. Shadow limped down the porch steps, each movement jarring his hip until nausea rose in his throat. He swallowed it down, focusing on the scent trail. It was faint, half erased by drifting powder, but it was there. He lowered his nose, moving in short, halting steps, snuffling the snow, his ears twitching forward and back, forward and back. His tail stood straight out, stiff with concentration. Lucas dropped to his knees in the snow, scooping up handfuls, searching for footprints, a glove. Anything. His breath came in gasps, white plumes catching in the porch light. His fingers froze instantly, the skin burning raw and numb, but he didn't care. "Lily?" he whispered, voice breaking. "Oh God, baby girl, where are you?" Shadow let out another howl. This one shorter, sharper, edged with urgency. He turned his head, staring at Lucas with eyes gone wide and dark. Then he barked twice deep and commanding before turning back to the snow and moving forward a few steps, nose still low. Lucas scrambled to his feet. The howl cut through the haze of panic clouding his mind. He forced himself to think like a seal again, to push back terror and focus. "Track her, Shadow," he commanded, voice harsh and trembling. "Find Lily." Shadow's ears flicked at the familiar command. He huffed out a cloud of vapor and moved forward another yard, then another, dragging his bad leg behind him. Pain lanced up his side with every step, but he ignored it, locking onto the fading scent trail weaving through the drifts. Lucas stumbled after him, eyes darting from the dog to the tree line. Snowflakes melted on his burning cheeks. His breath came in ragged pants. Each footstep crunched in the snow, the sound swallowed instantly by the roaring wind. Ahead of them, the yard ended in a line of split-rail fence. Beyond that lay the forest, dark, endless, silent, except for the keening of the storm. The porch light didn't reach that far. The world beyond the fence was black, absolute, and unknowable. Shadow paused at the fence nose pressed against the bottom rail. His ears twitched forward and back as he sniffed frantically along the ground. He let out a whine, low and desperate, and pawed at the snow, digging down to where scent might cling to the frozen grass beneath. Lucas vaulted over the fence, his boots sinking deep on the other side. He turned back, reaching for Shadow. The dog gathered himself, crouched slightly despite the pain tearing through his hip, and sprang. His hind leg gave out halfway over, sending him crashing onto his side in the snow. He yelped a sharp, pained cry, but scrambled to his feet immediately, shaking his head and huffing clouds of vapor. "Easy, boy," Lucas whispered, grabbing his collar. He crouched beside him, eyes scanning the darkness. The forest loomed ahead, trees swaying and creaking in the gale branches, clattering like old bones. He drew a ragged breath, feeling the icy air tear at his lungs. "We'll find her, Shadow," he said hoarsely. "We'll find her?" Shadow turned his head, their eyes meeting in the dark. The dog's gaze burned with pain, determination, and something else, rage, cold and pure. He turned back to the ground, nose pressed low, and began to move forward into the darkness. The wind howled snowflakes sweeping past them in glittering, swirling curtains. The last traces of Lily's scent vanished into the storm behind them as man and dog stepped into the forest, swallowed by the night. Lucas stumbled back through the snow, his chest heaving with ragged breaths that burned his lungs with each inhale. The cold cut into him, slicing through flannel and denim, finding every crack in his layers with icy fingers. He climbed the porch steps 2 at a time, nearly slipping on the ice-coated boards, and slammed into the mudroom door so hard it rattled on its hinges. Shadow limped behind him. His breathing labored, leaving a staggered trail of paw prints half filled by drifting flakes. Inside, Lucas grabbed the landline phone from its cradle on the kitchen wall and punched 911 with fingers stiff and clumsy from cold. 911, what is your emergency? "My daughter," he gasped, voice breaking. "My daughter's missing. 4 years old. Blonde hair, blue eyes, pink fleece hat, green boots with frogs. She was just in the yard. The snow, she's gone." "Sir, calm down," the dispatcher said, her voice professional, but edged with urgency. "What is your address?" 173. Pine Hollow Road, 3 miles north of Purgatory Creek. Please hurry. "Units are en route. Stay on the line." Shadow whined low in his chest ears, flicking toward the door tail stiff behind him. Lucas sank to his knees, beside the dog, pressing his forehead against Shadow's broad neck, feeling the warmth of his fur seep into his frozen skin. "We'll find her," he whispered, tears slipping hot and silent down his face. "We'll find her." The dispatcher's voice droned in his ear as Lucas dropped the phone to the kitchen floor and scrambled to the mudroom. He shoved his feet into snow boots, fingers shaking as he zipped up his tactical parka and grabbed the headlamp from its hook above the coat rack. Shadow limped forward, pressing against his thigh, his whole body vibrating with urgency. Lucas flicked on the headlamp, its white beam slicing through the swirling snow beyond the windows. He grabbed his radio transceiver from the shelf near the door, old military surplus, but still tuned to the sheriff's emergency frequency. His thumb jammed down the transmit button. "This is Lucas Parker, daughter missing, 4 years old, last seen outside my cabin 10 minutes ago. Pine Hollow Road, requesting immediate assistance." Static crackled for a moment before a calm male voice responded. "Copy, Mr. Parker. This is Deputy Reynolds. Units en route from Purgatory Creek. ETA, 15 minutes. Any sign of tracks or direction of travel?" "No tracks," Lucas choked out. "Snow's covering everything. My dog's tracking, but she's just gone." "Stay put until units arrive." "I'm not staying put," Lucas growled. He released the button and stuffed the radio into his pocket. He turned to Shadow, who stood trembling, his injured leg tucked awkwardly against his belly chest, heaving from the exertion of trying to stay upright. "Let's go, boy," Lucas said hoarsely. He threw open the mudroom door. The storm slammed into him, with the force of a charging bull, ripping the breath from his lungs and driving needles of frozen snow into his exposed skin. He stumbled down the steps, boots sinking past his ankles in the deepening drifts. Shadow limped after him, grunting softly with each step, nostrils flaring as he searched the air for Lily's scent. A pair of headlights swung around the curve of the road below the cabin. A dark green pickup crunched up the drive, snow chains rattling against the tires. The driver door opened, and a broad-shouldered man in a canvas jacket climbed out, pulling a knitted beanie down over his ears. "Lucas," he shouted over the wind. "Heard it on the scanner." "Where was she last?" "Backyard," Lucas shouted back, his voice ragged with panic. "She was making a snow angel. I turned around and she was gone." It was Hank Whitaker, their closest neighbor, who lived a quarter-mile down the forest road. A retired forest ranger, Hank moved with the quiet confidence of a man used to danger. His eyes sharp beneath bushy gray brows. "Got my dogs with me," Hank said, jerking his thumb toward the truck where two German shepherds barked anxiously against the rear window. "Sheriff's on the way. Let's move." Lucas nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Shadow pushed past him, nose low to the snow, sniffing frantically. Each step sent a tremor up his side, his hind leg dragging, but he pressed forward, ears, pricked eyes locked on the dark tree line. The three men moved through the yard flashlights and headlamps, slashing beams of white through the storm. Snowflakes swirled in dizzying eddies around them, erasing the world beyond their small islands of light. The only sounds were the crunch of boots, the low whines of the tracking dogs, and Lucas's ragged breathing. Shadow stopped suddenly, his body stiffening. He raised his head and let out a single echoing howl that pierced through the trees and rolled back across the valley. Lucas dropped to his knees beside him, grabbing fistfuls of his fur tears freezing on his lashes. "Please," he whispered. "Please, Shadow. Find her. Please, God." Shadow turned his head, their eyes meeting in the flickering glow of Lucas's headlamp. In those dark depths burned a resolve older than pain, stronger than fear. Then he dropped his nose to the snow again, dragging himself forward into the teeth of the storm. Behind them, Hank opened the truck's rear door and unleashed his shepherds. The dogs bounded forward, their muscular bodies moving in synchronized sweeps as they cast for scent. Hank spoke low into his radio mic. "This is Whitaker. On scene with Lucas Parker. 2 canines deployed. Negative tracks so far. Storms erasing everything." The radio crackled back. "Copy that, Hank. Search and rescue inbound. ETA 10 minutes. State police deploying chopper when storm clears." Lucas heard none of it. His world had shrunk to the faint trail Shadow struggled to follow, an intermittent thread of scent ripped apart by screaming winds and drifting powder. Every few steps, Shadow stumbled his injured leg, giving out, sending him to his knees in the snow. But each time he rose again, shaking his head, ears flat against his skull chest, heaving with exertion. "Easy, buddy," Lucas rasped, pushing to his feet. He pressed a hand to Shadow's neck, feeling the heat of him under his frozen palm. "You're okay. You're okay. Just find her. Please." Shadow sniffed the ground again, moving forward with jerky, halting strides. His tail stood out straight behind him, Hackle's raised body quivering with adrenaline and pain. His breath came in harsh, panting gasps that formed plumes of steam in the freezing air. The wind screamed down the mountainside, bending the trees into swaying shadows that creaked and groaned above them. Branches snapped under the weight of ice, crashing down into the snow with muffled thumps. Flakes swirled in endless shifting curtains, disorienting, hypnotic. Lucas staggered after Shadow boots, punching through crusted drifts to sink into powder up to his shins. Behind them, Hank moved in a wide arc, his dogs sweeping back and forth in practiced patterns, their tails, stiff ears, flicking at every faint sound. His flashlight beam cut across the snow, illuminating half-buried saplings and broken branches that stuck up like skeletal fingers. Shadow paused again, his body-rigid nose pressed low to the snow. He sniffed, whined, sniffed again, then raised his head, staring into the darkness. A deep rumble started in his chest, vibrating through Lucas's palm. "What is it?" Lucas whispered. Shadow's ears pricked forward. He sniffed once more, then let out another howl. This one shorter, sharper, edged with urgency and rage. Then he turned back to the ground, dragging himself forward, his bad leg trembling violently with each step. Lucas dropped to his knees beside him again. His hands shook as he buried his fingers into Shadow's thick ruff, gripping fistfuls of fur. Tears burned hot in his eyes, spilling down his cheeks and freezing in the whipping wind. "Please," he sobbed, voice breaking. "Please, boy. Find her. She's all I've got left. Please." Shadow turned his head, their eyes meeting in the flickering shadows of Lucas's headlamp. In those dark, liquid eyes burned loyalty so fierce it hurt to look at. Then the dog lowered his head again and pressed forward into the darkness, his body trembling. His breaths ragged and uneven, but his eyes blazing with the quiet fury of a soldier who knew his mission had only one acceptable outcome. Behind them, the forest swallowed the sounds of the search party. The wind howled, the snow fell, and somewhere ahead beyond the reach of flashlights and hope, a little girl waited for her heroes to find her. Shadow paused at the edge of the clearing, his paws sinking into the powder as he stared into the tree line. The pine trunks stood dark and silent against the swirling snow, their upper branches whipping back and forth with each icy gust. His chest heaved as he panted, steam curling from his muzzle in short, ragged bursts. His injured hind leg trembled with exertion, threatening to buckle beneath him. Lucas stumbled forward, boots crunching over the crusted drifts, and dropped to one knee beside Shadow. He pressed a gloved hand to the dog's thick ruff, feeling the heat radiating off him like a furnace. "What is it, boy?" he whispered, his voice breaking from fear and exhaustion. "What do you smell?" Shadow's ears flicked forward. He sniffed once, twice, then let out a low, guttural growl that rumbled deep in his chest. The sound raised goosebumps along Lucas's arms, despite the freezing wind slicing through his coat. The dog's hackles rose a trembling ridge down his spine. His tail stiffened straight out behind him, quivering with tension. Then, without warning, Shadow launched forward. He sprang into the snowdrift, sending a spray of powder into the wind, and barreled into the darkness of the trees. His body moved with surprising power despite the injury. His bad leg barely touched the ground before his muscles pulled it up again, each stride jerky, but propelling him forward at a desperate, reckless pace. Shadow, Lucas roared, stumbling to his feet. He lurched forward, nearly falling as his boot punched through a hidden drift up to his thigh. The cold burned against his jeans, slicing into his skin like knives. He forced his numb legs to move, pushing himself after the dog. Ahead, Shadow vanished between the pines. The beam of Lucas's headlamp flickered across tree trunks and branches, heavy with snow, catching fleeting glimpses of the dog's hindquarters and lashing tail as he wove through the forest. Lucas's lungs burned with each ragged gasp, the icy air tearing at his throat. The darkness swallowed them thick and absolute, broken only by the halo of his headlamp bouncing across the snow. Shadow ran, his vision narrowed to a tunnel, everything blurring, except the scent trail weaving before him like a golden thread. The pain in his hip roared with each stride, white-hot, almost blinding. But he pushed it down, pushed it away, focusing only on the fading scent of the little girl who smelled of milk and pine needles and warmth. His paws tore across the crusted snow nails, scraping at roots and frozen ground beneath. Every muscle burned with exhaustion. His lungs heaved for air. His heart thundered against his ribs so hard it felt like it might explode. But he ran. Lucas tripped over a half-buried branch and fell hard onto his hands and knees. Snow packed into his gloves, melting instantly against his skin. He gasped, wincing at the jolt of pain shooting up his wrists. He forced himself upright, fighting the rising panic clawing at his chest. "Shadow," he shouted into the trees, his voice swallowed by the wind. "Wait." But Shadow did not wait. He burst into a small, clearing, snow spraying up around him in glittering arcs. The world slowed. In the flickering moonlight, breaking through thin clouds overhead, he looked like a phantom. His black and tan fur streaked with snow. His ears pinned back against his skull, his eyes blazing gold in the dim light. His legs pumped muscles straining his bad leg, trailing awkwardly behind, but never slowing his momentum. Behind him, Lucas stumbled into the clearing chest, heaving sweat freezing against his skin despite the biting wind. He froze at the sight before him. Shadow raced forward faster than Lucas had ever seen him move since the injury. Each stride was powered by pure desperation, raw instinct overriding pain. The snow parted around him like waves as he plunged deeper into the forest, paws slamming down with fierce determination. In that moment, Lucas saw not an injured old war dog, but the unstoppable K9 he'd known in Afghanistan. The dog who had dragged him from the blast zone, who had ripped enemy combatants from their hiding spots, who had saved him and others more times than he could remember. He saw the soldier's Shadow had once been. The hero he still was. Lucas's vision blurred with tears that froze almost instantly on his lashes. His legs trembled as he forced them to move, following the dark streak weaving between the trees ahead. Each step felt heavier than the last. His thighs burned, his boots slipped on hidden patches of ice beneath the drifts. Branches clawed at his coat, whipping across his face and leaving thin, stinging cuts along his cheekbones. Shadow ran. He no longer felt the pain in his hip, no longer felt the weakness in his leg. His mind had gone quiet, his senses narrowing to the hot trail weaving ahead. He could smell Lily now, faint and cold and fading, but there, mixed with something else. Something that made his lips curl back from his teeth in a silent snarl, a scent he remembered from Afghanistan. Gun oil, sweat, fear. A stranger's scent mixed with his girl's. His ears flattened against his skull. A low growl rumbled in his chest as he bounded forward, snow flying out behind him in a crystalline spray. Kibong toi de joie, a voice whispered in Lucas's mind as he ran, hearing his wife's soft words from so many nights ago, curled up on the couch, with Lily asleep in her arms, Shadow lying at their feet. Kibong toi đe dọa những linh hồn can đảm nhất mới tỏa sáng. When darkness threatens the bravest souls, shine the brightest. He stumbled over a buried root and fell to his knees again. Snow spraying up around him. He gasped, chest-burning arms trembling from exhaustion and cold. His vision narrowed to the flickering beam of his headlamp, catching Shadow as the dog weaved between trees, ahead a phantom in the swirling storm. "Please," he rasped, his breath steaming out in ragged clouds. "Please, Shadow, don't lose her." Shadow's ears twitched as he heard Lucas's voice behind him. But he did not slow. Could not slow. Each stride sent pain lancing up his side, a hot, tearing agony that stole his breath. But he gritted his teeth, jaw clenched so tight his molars ached, and ran harder. His hind leg dragged at odd angles now, each impact threatening to snap it under his weight. But he pushed forward each step, driven by something deeper than instinct, deeper than training. Love. Fierce, primal, unbreakable love. Ahead the trees thinned, the storm winds screaming down through the gap, with a sound like freight trains barreling down steel tracks. Shadow burst into the clearing beyond his paws, skidding across a frozen creek hidden beneath the drifts. He staggered, nearly falling, then righted himself, nose sweeping side to side. The scent was stronger here, fresh, close. He raised his head, ears pricking forward, eyes narrowing against the wind. A shape moved at the far edge of the clearing, a small pink blur hunched beside a fallen log, half buried in snow. Shadow's chest heaved with relief. A whine rose in his throat. But then another shape moved beside her. Larger, dark, wrong. His lips peeled back from his teeth in a snarl. A deep growl thundered up from his chest, vibrating through his ribs and echoing into the storm. Behind him, Lucas burst into the clearing boots, sliding across the frozen creek. His headlamp beam caught on Lily's hat, the green frog boots tucked up against her chest as she crouched in the snow. His heart seized in his chest, tears springing to his eyes. "Lily," he shouted, voice a-cracking. She turned her head, eyes wide and blank with shock. But before she could speak, the dark shape beside her shifted, straightening up to reveal itself as a man bundled in ragged winter gear. A rifle slung over one shoulder, his face hidden by a black scarf. Shadow snarled, the sound vibrating deep and furious in the stillness. The man turned startled, his eyes narrowing behind frost-covered goggles. "Back off, mutt," he growled, reaching for the gun. Shadow lunged. Pain tore through his hip as his injured leg folded under him mid-stride. But he didn't stop. His jaws closed over the man's forearm, just as his hand closed on the rifle strap. The man screamed, the sound high and thin, lost in the roaring wind. Blood sprayed across the snow as Shadow's teeth sank through thick canvas and flesh to the bone beneath. Lucas moved before he could think. Training took over. He sprinted forward, covering the clearing in 3 strides, his boots punching through drifts as he closed the distance. The man was screaming now, battering at Shadow's head with his free hand, but the dog held fast, his jaws locked, growling deep and savage. Lucas tackled the man from behind, driving his shoulder into his back with all his weight. They hit the snow hard, the rifle skidding out of reach. Shadow released his bite and sprang back, circling Hackle's raised lips, peeled back in a snarl. The man twisted under Lucas, snarling curses clawing at his face. Lucas slammed his elbow into the man's jaw, feeling bone crunch beneath the impact. The man went limp, his breath steaming out in a long, ragged gasp. Lucas rolled away, gasping for air, his chest heaving. He turned to Lily, who still sat frozen in the snow, tears streaming down her flushed cheeks. Shadow limped to her side, pressing his nose into her hair, whining deep in his chest. "Daddy," she sobbed, reaching for him with trembling hands. Lucas pulled her into his arms, clutching her so tight, she let out a soft cry of pain. But she wrapped her arms around his neck and buried her face in his collar, sobbing against his skin. "It's okay," he whispered, rocking her back and forth despite the freezing wind whipping around them. "It's okay, Bug. I've got you. I've got you." Shadow stood over them, chest heaving, blood dripping from his jaws onto the snow. His injured leg buckled, and he sank onto his haunches, panting hard. But his eyes stayed locked on the man, sprawled motionless in the snow. Ears pricked forward, muscles tense, ready to fight again, if needed. Lucas looked up at him, tears streaming down his cheeks, freezing instantly in the wind. "Good boy," he whispered, voice breaking. "Good boy." Shadow's ears flicked back, and for a moment his eyes softened. Then he turned his gaze back to the forest, the warrior once more ready to protect his family from whatever darkness lurked beyond. Shadow limped forward, his paws crunching into the thickening snow as he pushed deeper into the forest. Every step sent pain lancing up through his hip, hot and white and blinding. His chest heaved, each breath a ragged gasp that curled into the frigid air in steaming clouds. Behind him, Lucas stumbled, boots punching through drifts that rose past his knees, arms flailing as he fought to keep up. Shadow, he gasped, his voice torn away by the wind. "Slow down, buddy, please." But Shadow didn't slow. Couldn't slow. His ears flicked forward and back, his nostrils flaring with every stride as he traced the faint fading trail of Lily's scent. It was growing stronger now, closer, sharper, tinged with something else. Something cold. Something wrong. He burst through a thick tangle of snow-draped underbrush branches, clawing at his flanks and scraping across his muzzle, leaving thin, stinging cuts along his nose. The forest floor dropped away, suddenly sloping down into a shallow ravine where the wind tore through the trees in screaming gusts. Snow whipped through the narrow gully in swirling eddies coating the trunks in frozen rime. Shadow paused at the edge of the drop, panting hard. His hind legs shook violently beneath him, threatening to fold, but he locked his muscles, forcing it to hold. His ears pricked forward. He sniffed the air, nose twitching. There, just below him, tucked beneath the drooping branches of a fallen pine, yawned the dark mouth of a den. The scent poured out of it. Lily, cold, terrified, fading. And underneath that, the musky tang of fox fur, stale and faint. An old den abandoned for the winter. Shadow whimpered deep in his chest, his tail wagging once in short relief. He scrambled down the slope, his paws sliding on the icy ground. Pain roared through his hip as his bad leg folded under him, and he tumbled sideways, crashing into the snow with a muffled yelp. For a moment he lay there, gasping, vision flickering at the edges, with black and red sparks. The agony was so intense he almost couldn't breathe. But then he heard it, the faintest sound drifting up from the darkness of the den. A soft, broken little moan. A child's voice cracked with cold and exhaustion. Shadow forced himself upright. His hind leg dragged uselessly behind him, now every nerve screaming, but he ignored it. He planted his front paws against the packed snow at the mouth of the den and shoved his head inside ears, flattening to squeeze through the narrow opening. Inside it was dark and close, the ceiling so low, his back scraped against the frozen dirt. The walls pressed in on either side, lined with dry, matted grass that smelled of old fur and stale earth. The scent of Lily was everywhere now, sharp and desperate. He crawled forward, claws scraping against the frozen ground. The darkness closed around him, his shoulders brushing the narrowing walls, but he pressed on, driven by something deeper than pain, deeper than fear. The tunnel curved gently to the left, and as he rounded the bend, his eyes caught a faint glimmer of pink in the darkness. Lily lay curled on her side, against the far wall of the den, her little body trembling violently with shivers. Her pink fleece hat had slipped halfway off her head, exposing damp curls matted with frost. Her green frog boots were caked in frozen mud, her jeans soaked through and stiff with ice. Her lips were blue. Her eyelids fluttered, half-closed lashes rimmed with tiny frozen droplets. Shadow whimpered a low, desperate sound. He crawled the last few feet, dragging his bad leg behind him, and pressed his nose against her cheek. Her skin was so cold it burned. He licked her face once, twice, pushing his muzzle against her in frantic little nudges. For a moment she didn't move. Her eyelids flickered, her lashes trembling. Then, a tiny broken voice whispered out of the darkness, so soft he almost didn't hear it. "Shadow." His heart lurched in his chest, a deep, aching pulse that radiated through his ribs and into his lungs. He licked her face again, pushing his nose into the hollow of her neck, whining deep in his chest. She shifted slightly, a small shuddering movement, and her hand twitched against the dirt. Her mitten was missing, and her fingers were pale and stiff with cold. Behind them, Lucas crashed down into the ravine, his boots skidding across the ice. He fell hard to his knees, the impact jarring up through his thighs into his spine. For a moment he knelt there, gasping, staring at the dark mouth of the den in the snowbank. Panic clawed at his chest, tearing at his ribs with icy fingers. "Shadow," he shouted, his voice ragged and hoarse. "Shadow, where is she?" From inside the den came a muffled whine, high and desperate. Lucas scrambled forward on hands and knees, clawing at the packed snow around the entrance, widening it with frantic shoves. His gloves tore on hidden roots and sharp stones, blood welling along his knuckles, freezing instantly in the sub-zero air. He shoved his head into the opening, his chest too broad to fit, and yelled into the darkness. "Lily, baby girl, can you hear me?" There was no answer. Only Shadow's whine vibrating up through the frozen earth like a trapped echo. Lucas's heart clenched so hard he thought it might stop. He sat back on his heels, chest heaving, tears freezing on his lashes. The world spun around him. the trees blurring the wind screaming in his ears. For a moment he couldn't think, couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Then he heard it. So faint he almost missed it, carried on the wind like a dying breath. "Daddy!" He lunged forward, shoving his arm into the den up to the shoulder fingers scrabbling in the dark. His fingertips brushed against fabric's soft fleece. He grabbed it, felt it tear under his desperate grip, but he didn't let go. He shifted his weight, wedging his shoulder deeper into the narrow opening, ignoring the sharp pain as frozen roots scraped across his cheek. "Lily," he gasped, voice breaking. "Daddy's here, baby girl. I've got you. I've got you." Shadow shifted inside the den, pressing his body against Lily's back, wrapping himself around her as best he could in the cramped space. He licked her face again, whining softly, his breath warming the frozen skin of her cheek. Her eyelids fluttered open, blue eyes dull and glassy, staring unfocused into the darkness. "Shadow," she whispered again, so faint he felt the word more than heard it. Her lips barely moved, the word escaping on a trembling exhale. Shadow pressed his nose against her lips, feeling the shallow puff of her breath. Relief flooded him, hot and dizzying, almost making him collapse. He whined again, louder this time, the sound echoing up the tunnel to where Lucas struggled to reach them. Lucas clawed at the snow around the entrance, widening it inch by inch. His gloves shredded his fingers, bleeding, but he didn't feel it. His world had narrowed to the sound of Shadow's whining and the faint, broken breaths of his daughter trapped in the dark. "Hold on, baby," he gasped. "Hold on for Daddy. Hold on for Shadow." Inside the den, Shadow shifted his weight again, pushing his chest against Lily's back. His body burned with pain, his hind leg numb now, but he ignored it. He curled himself tighter around her, pressing his belly against her soaked jeans, trying to share what little heat his failing body still produced. He licked her face again and again, each touch desperate, frantic, as if he could will her blood to move faster, her heart to beat stronger, her lungs to breathe deeper. Outside, Lucas ripped at the snow, shoving aside chunks of frozen earth until the entrance widened enough for him to wedge both shoulders into the opening. He pushed forward, scraping his chest and hips along the packed dirt, ignoring the pain as roots clawed at his skin. His headlamp beam flickered and danced across the cramped tunnel, illuminating flashes of Shadow's dark fur and Lily's pink fleece hat. "Lily," he gasped, his voice shaking. "Baby girl, look at me. Look at Daddy." Her eyes flickered toward him, dull and unfocused, but they moved. Her lips parted, a tiny puff of vapor escaping. Shadow turned his head eyes, meeting Lucas's with fierce determination. The dog's ears flicked forward, his tail thumped once against the dirt floor, and he licked Lily's face again. Lucas reached forward, his fingers brushing her cheek, feeling the icy chill of her skin. His chest seized with terror. He slid forward another inch, ignoring the agony, as his ribs scraped against frozen roots and wrapped his hand around her wrist. Her pulse fluttered weak and rapid beneath his thumb. "I've got you," he whispered, tears spilling down his cheeks. "Daddy's got you, Bug. You're gonna be okay." Shadow pressed his nose against Lily's neck, inhaling her scent, memorizing it, branding it onto every cell of his being. Then he shifted his weight, braced his good front paw against the dirt floor, and began to inch backward, dragging himself out of the tunnel. His bad legs scraped against the packed earth, sending fresh bursts of pain shooting up his side. But he didn't slow. He pushed himself backward step by step until his shoulders cleared the tunnel entrance. Lucas grabbed Shadow's harness, hauling him the last few inches free. The dog collapsed onto the snow with a grunt, chest-heaving eyes glazed with pain but locked on Lily. Lucas shoved himself forward again, reaching for his daughter. His fingers curled around her arm, feeling the fragile bone beneath the sodden fleece. With a desperate guttural yell, he hauled her toward him, inch by inch, scraping her body along the frozen dirt. Her hat snagged on a root and slipped from her head, exposing damp blonde curls matted with frost. Her eyes fluttered, lips moving in a silent whisper. Shadow whined deep in his chest, pressing his nose against her shoulder as Lucas dragged her free. Finally, her small body slid out of the tunnel and into his arms. Lucas collapsed backward into the snow, cradling her against his chest. Her head lolled against his collarbone, eyes, half-closed, lips blue and trembling. Shadow pushed himself upright with a pained grunt and pressed his head against Lily's side, licking her face again and again. His tail wagged weakly against the snow, each movement sending fresh tremors of pain through his hip. Lucas pressed his forehead against hers, tears freezing against his cheeks. He rocked her back and forth, whispering broken words into her hair. I've got you, baby girl. Daddy's here. Daddy's here." Shadow lay beside them, chest heaving, his eyes locked on Lily's face as her eyelids fluttered closed. His ears flicked forward, listening to her shallow breathing, and he let out a long, trembling sigh. Outside, the storm raged on snow, swirling around them in endless blinding sheets. But in that moment, in that tiny hollow beneath the trees, there was warmth. There was love. There was hope. And there was Shadow still fighting, still guarding, still loving with every last beat of his warrior's heart. Lucas clutched Lily against his chest, feeling the violent tremors shaking her small frame as she sobbed into his collar. Shadow lay half-collapsed beside them, panting hard, his ribs heaving with each ragged breath. Blood oozed slowly from a fresh cut on his flank where a sharp root had scraped away fur and skin during the rescue crawl, matting his thick coat with dark clots. But his eyes burned fierce and bright in the darkness, locked protectively on the tree line behind Lucas. For a moment the world narrowed to the desperate gasps of their breathing. The distant scream of the wind tearing through the pines overhead and the hiss of snow falling around them in endless waves. Lucas tucked Lily's frozen hands under his armpits, trying to warm them with his own body heat. Tears pricked behind his eyes at how limp they felt, how small. Shadow whined softly, pressing his nose against her knee, his tail twitching in weak relief. Then the world shifted. From somewhere behind them, beyond the swirling wall of falling snow, came a sound that froze Lucas's blood in his veins. A laugh. Low, sharp, and edged with malice. A sound without warmth slicing through the storm like a blade of ice. "Well, well, well," a voice drawled, thick with contempt and amusement. "What do we have here?" Lucas turned his head, heart hammering so hard he thought his ribs might crack. The wind gusted, parting the curtain of snow for a moment, and two figures emerged from the darkness between the trees. They moved with an unhurried confidence that turned Lucas's stomach to ice. Both men wore heavy winter jackets stained with old grease and dirt. Their camouflage pants torn and fraying, around battered boots caked in frozen mud. One was tall and gaunt with stringy hair hanging in greasy clumps from under a ripped beanie. His beard was wild and matted against his collar. The other was shorter, but thicker through the chest, shoulders bulging beneath his tattered Carhartt coat. His beard was streaked with white and twisted into thin braids that swung as he walked. Each man carried a rifle slung across his chest, the barrels pointing at the ground with casual menace. Their eyes gleamed in the dim light of Lucas's flickering headlamp, flat hard cold. "Looks like we found ourselves a little family reunion," the tall one said, his lips curling back to reveal yellowed teeth. "Ain't that sweet, Jed?" The thicker man chuckled low in his chest. A rumbling growl that never touched his dead eyes. "Sweet as a fresh kill," he rasped. He leaned his head sideways, cracking his neck with a loud pop. "Look at that pretty pink hat. Jackpot here for sure." Lucas pulled Lily tighter against him, shifting his body so he blocked her from view. His pulse thundered in his ears. He tasted bile in the back of his throat. Shadow let out a deep, guttural growl, his hackles rising along his spine. The fur on his shoulders bristled, and he bared his teeth in a silent snarl. "Easy now, mutt," the taller man sneered, flicking his hand toward Shadow without looking directly at him. "Don't want you getting all riled up before we're ready." "Please," Lucas said, his voice hoarse and shaking despite his effort to keep it firm. "Take what you want." "We don't have anything. Just let her go. She's a child." "Oh, we know what she is," the thicker man said, his voice filled with quiet, deadly amusement. He took a step forward, his boots crunching in the snow. "That's what makes her so valuable." Shadow snarled louder now, the sound vibrating deep in his chest like distant thunder. He staggered upright, planting his good front paw into the snow and pushing himself forward until he stood between Lucas and the two men. His hind leg buckled under his weight, but he braced it, refusing to collapse. The tall man tilted his head slightly, studying Shadow with cold, analytical eyes. "What's wrong with it?" he asked. "Dog looks half crippled." "Doesn't matter." The thick man grunted, unslinging his rifle and flicking the safety off with a practiced thumb. "A bullet don't care if it limps?" Shadow's growl deepened. Ears pinned back, teeth bared in a snarl so fierce, his lips curled up to his gums. His eyes locked on the thick man, dark and blazing with fury. Shadow, Lucas whispered, feeling tears prick his eyes. "Stay. Please, don't." But the dog didn't hear him. Or if he did, he ignored it. The thick man leveled his rifle. "Sit down, old boy," he sneered, curling his finger around the trigger. Shadow lunged. It happened so fast, Lucas barely registered it. One moment the dog was crouched in the snow, his hind leg trembling, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. The next he was airborne, jaws wide, a roar tearing from his throat that seemed to shake the very trees around them. The rifle cracked. The gunshot rolled across the clearing, echoing off the frozen trunks in a thunderclap that sent a flock of ravens screaming into the dark sky above. Shadow's body twisted midair. The bullet slammed into his side just behind the ribs, spinning him sideways. He hit the ground hard, skidding across the snow, leaving a smear of dark blood in his wake. Shadow Lucas screamed, his voice breaking. Shadow lay in the snow, his chest heaving, blood bubbling around the edges of the entry wound. For a moment his eyes rolled back in his head. Then he blinked, shuddered, and tried to rise. His front paws scrabbled at the crusted snow claws, digging deep grooves, but his hindquarters wouldn't follow. He collapsed back down with a pained whine, his ears pinned flat against his skull. "Goddamn mutt," the thick man growled, chambering another round with a loud metallic click. "Should have just stayed down. Leave him alone," Lucas roared, voice shaking with rage and terror. He pulled Lily tighter against his chest, curling around her protectively. Tears streamed down his cheeks, freezing in the biting wind. "Please, don't hurt him. He's just a dog, please." The tall man let out a sharp, barking laugh. "Ain't no such thing as just a dog, city boy," he sneered. "Not when it gets in the way of business." Shadow tried to rise again. His chest heaved with each ragged breath. Blood spread in a growing pool beneath him, staining the snow dark and steaming in the cold. His eyes burned with fury and pain, locked on the thick man's face with unwavering hate. The thick man raised his rifle again, barrel trained on Shadow's heaving ribs. His finger tightened on the trigger. "Shadow?" Lucas whispered, choking on a sob. "No. Please, God. No." Shadow's ears flicked toward his voice, and for a brief moment his eyes softened. His tail twitched once against the snow. Then he turned his gaze back to the thick man and bared his teeth in a final defiant snarl. Enough, a new voice barked, sharp and commanding. Both men froze. The thick man's finger slipped off the trigger. The tall man spun around his rifle, half raised. From between the trees behind them stepped another figure, his outline blurred by the swirling snow. He moved with an easy, quiet confidence, boots silent on the crusted drifts. As he stepped into the flickering edge of Lucas's headlamp beam, his face came into view. A scar ran from the corner of his mouth, down across his jaw, puckered and white against the weathered tan of his skin. His eyes were dark and flat, cold as the wind sweeping through the trees. A black knit cap covered his head, pulled low over close-cropped hair. His jacket was clean and unpatched, unlike the others, and beneath it he wore a tactical vest with magazine pouches neatly strapped across his chest. He surveyed the scene in a single sweeping glance, his eyes moving from Lucas and Lily to Shadow bleeding in the snow, then to the two men standing frozen with their rifles half raised. "What the hell is this?" he asked, his voice soft but edged with steel. The thick man shifted his weight uneasily, the barrel of his rifle dropping slightly. "Found them here, boss," he muttered. "Just cleaning up." "Cleaning up," the scarred man repeated quietly, his eyes narrowed, lips curling into a thin, humorless smile. "That's not what I asked you to do." The tall man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his scraggly beard. "We thought—" "You didn't think," the scarred man interrupted sharply. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but every word landed with the force of a hammer blow. "You acted, and now we've got witnesses. Complications." He stepped forward, moving between them, his boots crunching softly over the frozen ground. He crouched beside Shadow, studying the dog with cold, analytical detachment. Shadow growled weakly, his lips peeling back from his teeth, but the sound was thin, trembling with pain. The scarred man reached out and pressed two gloved fingers against the bullet wound. Shadow let out a sharp, gasping yelp, his whole body shuddering. "He's dying," the scarred man said calmly. "Leave him. He won't make it to dawn." Then he stood and turned his gaze on Lucas. Their eyes met, and Lucas felt his blood run cold at the utter emptiness he saw there. The scarred man tilted his head slightly, as if studying an insect pinned under glass. "Get the girl," he said quietly. The thick man moved forward, slinging his rifle behind him and reaching out with thick, calloused fingers. Lucas clutched Lily tighter, pulling her against his chest, feeling her sobs rack her small frame. "No," he gasped, voice breaking. "Please, please don't take her. Please." The scarred man's eyes flicked to him, then back to the thick man. "If he resists, shoot him." Shadow bared his teeth, summoning the last dregs of his strength. A deep, shuddering growl rumbled from his chest. Blood foamed around his muzzle as he forced himself upright on trembling front legs. His vision blurred and darkened at the edges, but he locked his gaze on the man, reaching for Lily, and snarled. "Jed," the tall man said, uneasily stepping back. "Careful. That dog's still got fight in him." "Then I'll put him down," Jed growled, reaching for the pistol strapped to his thigh. Shadow crouched, every nerve screaming with agony. His bad leg dragged uselessly behind him. His chest burned with each labored breath. But his eyes stayed locked on the man, reaching for Lily, and in them burned a promise as ancient and immutable as death itself. "You will not touch her while I live." Lucas pressed Lily tighter against his chest, feeling her shallow breaths warming the collar of his coat. His mind raced, his pulse thundering in his ears so loud it drowned out the screaming wind and the creaking trees. Snow whipped past them in blinding sheets, but he saw everything with perfect, terrible clarity. The thick man. Jed reached for Lily again, his gloved fingers closing around her upper arm. She whimpered softly, her head rolling weakly against Lucas's chest. No, Lucas rasped, his voice breaking with fury and fear. No, don't touch her. The scarred man, standing a few feet away, tilted his head slightly, studying Lucas with the cold detachment of a predator who'd already decided the outcome of the hunt. His lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. Kill him, he said softly. Jed grunted and shifted his grip on Lily, pulling her away from Lucas's chest. Lucas lunged forward, grabbing for her, but the thick man's free hand slammed into his face, an open-handed blow so powerful it sent him sprawling backward into the snow. Pain exploded through his skull, bright white and blinding. The world spun around him, a swirling maelstrom of darkness and falling snow. Shadow snarled, his lips peeling back from blood-flecked teeth. He staggered upright on trembling legs, his bad leg dragging uselessly behind him. Blood oozed steadily from the bullet wound in his ribs, staining the snow beneath him, dark and steaming in the cold. But his eyes burned with feral rage, locked on the man raising his rifle toward Lucas. The tall man stepped forward, his rifle half raised. Stay down, mutt, he sneered. Lucas's vision cleared just in time to see Jed yank Lily fully out of his arms, her small body limp and trembling. Rage ripped through him like wildfire, burning away exhaustion and fear. He surged to his feet, snow spraying up around him in glittering arcs. He charged. The tall man's eyes widened in surprise. But before he could react, Lucas slammed into him, full force driving his shoulder into the man's chest. They hit the ground hard, the rifle skidding away across the snow. Lucas landed on top of him, his knees pinning the man's arms down against his sides. The man snarled and bucked beneath him, trying to throw him off. Lucas drove his fist into his jaw with all his strength, feeling bone crunch beneath his knuckles. Pain lanced up through his wrist, but he ignored it, hitting him again and again. The man's head snapped sideways, blood spraying from his mouth to splatter across the snow in dark streaks. Behind them, Jed roared in rage, dropping Lily into the snow as he reached for the pistol holstered on his thigh. Shadow moved. He lunged forward with a savage snarl, his claws scraping across the ice-crusted ground. Pain tore through his hip, white-hot and blinding, but he didn't stop. His jaws closed around Jed's forearm, just as the man's hand closed on the pistol grip. Jed screamed, high and thin, as Shadow's teeth punched through the thick fabric of his coat and into flesh beneath. Blood welled around the dog's muzzle, hot and slick against his teeth. Shadow snarled and shook his head, ripping the man sideways and off balance. Lucas didn't see any of it. He was too busy fighting for his life. The tall man beneath him twisted violently, freeing one arm from under Lucas's knee. His hand shot to his belt, fingers closing around the hilt of a hunting knife strapped there. He yanked it free in one swift, practiced movement, the blade flashing in the flickering glow of Lucas's headlamp. Lucas saw it coming too late. The blade punched into his shoulder just above the collarbone, sliding between muscle and bone with a slick, wet sound. Pain exploded through him, hot and blinding, ripping a scream from his throat. His vision blurred with tears as the man twisted the blade deeper, his lips curling back in a snarl of triumph. Die, the man hissed. Lucas's left arm went numb instantly, his fingers curling uselessly against his thigh. The pain radiated down into his chest, stealing his breath. He gasped, choking on the taste of blood and bile rising in his throat. His vision darkened at the edges, the world narrowing to the gleaming knife handle jutting from his flesh. The man grinned up at him, blood smeared across his broken teeth. He raised the knife to strike again, angling it toward Lucas's ribs. Shadow snarled louder, the sound echoing across the clearing like rolling thunder. He released Jed's arm and lunged upward, his jaws closing around the man's throat. The scream died in Jed's mouth as Shadow's teeth crushed his windpipe in a single savage bite. Blood sprayed across the snow in a wide arc, steaming as it hit the frozen ground. Jed staggered backward, clawing at Shadow's head with both hands, his eyes bulging, mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Shadow snarled again, shaking his head violently. Bone crunched under his jaws, and the man collapsed sideways into the snow, his body convulsing once before going still. The scarred man watched it all, with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. He made no move to help, no flicker of emotion crossing his cold, flat gaze. Lucas screamed as the tall man's knife punched toward his ribs. He twisted sideways, the blade slicing across his chest instead, tearing through muscle and scraping along his ribcage. Pain Pain flared white-hot, stealing his breath, but he didn't stop moving. His right hand shot out, grabbing the man's wrist and slamming it down into the snow again and again until the knife slipped from his numb fingers. He rolled off the man, gasping, blood soaking through his shirt in hot, pulsing waves. The cold air bit into the open wounds, making his head spin with shock and agony. But he forced himself to stay conscious, blinking away tears as he scrambled across the snow toward Lily. She lay curled on her side, her pink hat half buried in the drifting snow. Her eyes open but unfocused lips trembling with silent whimpers. Blood speckled her cheek where Jed's splatter had sprayed across her face. Lucas scooped her up with his good arm, cradling her against his chest. His left arm hung useless at his side, blood dripping steadily from his fingertips to patter against the snow in tiny steaming droplets. Shadow limped to his side, his chest heaving, blood pouring from the bullet wound in his ribs. His hind leg dragged uselessly behind him, but his head stayed high. Ears pinned back, lips curled in a savage snarl as he faced the scarred man. For a long moment, the clearing fell silent. Snow drifted down around them in thick, muffling sheets, settling across blood-stained ground and still twitching bodies. The wind sighed through the trees, rattling frozen branches like dry bones. The scarred man tilted his head slightly, studying Lucas, Lily, and Shadow with eyes as empty as the winter sky above. Then he smiled, slow and thin, a smile without warmth or humanity. "Impressive," he said softly. He reached over his shoulder and drew his own rifle, checking the magazine with a practiced flick of his thumb. The weapon gleamed black and silent in the dim light, the barrel long and threaded for a suppressor. Shadow snarled louder, staggering forward to stand between Lucas and the approaching threat. His chest heaved, blood dripping steadily from his wound, leaving dark spatters in the snow. His eyes locked on the man's face, burning with pain and defiance. Lucas clutched Lily tighter, his vision blurring with tears. His chest burned with every ragged breath, hot blood soaking his shirt and freezing instantly against the bitter air. He could barely feel his left side anymore. Every pulse of pain made darkness flicker at the edges of his vision. "Shadow," he rasped, his voice shaking with grief and terror. Don't do it, please." But Shadow didn't look back at him. His gaze stayed locked on the scarred man's ears, pinned flat tail stiff and quivering with fury. His lips peeled back from his teeth in a silent snarl. Blood dripped steadily from his muzzle to patter softly against the snow. The scarred man raised his rifle, the movement slow and precise, deliberate and unhurried. His finger curled around the trigger. Shadow lunged. His muscles screamed in agony, his wounded hind leg trailing uselessly behind him. But he didn't care. All he saw was the scarred man raising the rifle toward Lucas and Lily. All he felt was the savage fury burning through his chest, like wildfire obliterating pain, fear, and exhaustion. He slammed into the man's side with all his weight, jaws snapping shut inches from the man's throat. The scarred man staggered sideways, his rifle swinging away from Lucas. Shadow snarled his teeth, scraping across the man's collarbone. But before he could clamp down, the man twisted violently, slamming the rifle stock into Shadow's wounded ribs. The impact was like a sledgehammer blow. Pain detonated through Shadow's chest, white-hot and blinding. He yelped and collapsed sideways into the snow, his bad leg folding under him, blood spraying from the torn wound in his side. Shadow Lucas screamed, his voice raw and breaking. The scarred man raised his rifle again, angling it down at the dog sprawled panting at his feet. But before he could pull the trigger, Lucas hurled himself forward with a hoarse roar of rage. He slammed into the man's knees, driving his shoulder into the side of his leg. The man grunted in surprise and stumbled, his finger tightening on the trigger. The rifle cracked the suppressed shot, a flat, vicious snap. Snow exploded in a spray inches from Shadow's head as the bullet punched into the ground. Lucas grappled desperately, his good hand grabbing for the rifle barrel. The man snarled and slammed his elbow down onto Lucas's back, driving him into the snow. Pain lanced through Lucas's shoulder wound, hot and electric, making his vision go white at the edges. He screamed and twisted sideways, wrenching the rifle from the man's grasp. The scarred man cursed and drew a combat knife from his belt, the blade flashing silver in the dim light. He slashed downward, aiming for Lucas's neck. Lucas rolled sideways, the blade slicing a thin line across his cheekbone, hot blood welling instantly into the freezing air. He didn't stop moving. Training took over old instincts buried under years of civilian life, roaring back with savage clarity. He twisted the rifle in his grip, braced it against his hip, and pulled the trigger. The suppressed shot cracked loud in the confined space. Snow sprayed from the ground between them as the bullet punched into the dirt, missing the man by inches. The scarred man snarled and lunged again, but Lucas drove the rifle butt upward into his jaw with brutal force. The man's head snapped back. Blood sprayed from his mouth. Lucas twisted, slamming the rifle barrel up under the man's chin, and squeezed the trigger. The shot was muffled, but deafening in the silence that followed. The man's body jerked once, then crumpled to the ground in a boneless heap, blood pouring from the ragged exit wound at the back of his head to steam in the freezing air. Lucas collapsed backward into the snow, gasping his chest, heaving with ragged breaths. His shoulder burned with white-hot pain, blood soaking through his shredded shirt in pulsing waves. He struggled to his knees, fumbling at the rifle with numb fingers, checking the chamber. Shadow snarled weakly behind him. Lucas spun just in time to see the thick man, Jed, staggering back to his feet. His arm hung limp at his side where Shadow had torn through muscle and tendon, but his other hand fumbled at the pistol holstered on his hip. His eyes were wide and bloodshot lips pulled back in a snarl of rage and pain. Shadow lunged again, but his hind leg buckled mid-stride, and he collapsed into the snow with a broken yelp. Jed let out a hoarse, triumphant laugh and kicked out savagely, his boots slamming into Shadow's ribs with a sickening crunch. Shadow yelped again, his body curling around the wound, blood spraying from his muzzle onto the snow. "Stay down, mutt!" Jed roared, drawing his pistol with trembling fingers. He swung it toward Shadow's head, his finger tightening on the trigger. Lucas screamed. He raised the rifle, sighted down the barrel with shaking hands, and fired. The suppressed shot cracked loud and flat. The bullet punched into Jed's shoulder, spinning him sideways with a scream of pain. His pistol flew from his hand, skidding across the snow. Lucas chambered another round, his teeth bared in a snarl, and fired again. This time, the bullet punched into Jed's chest just below the collarbone. The impact slammed him backward into the snow, his mouth opening in a silent scream, eyes wide with shock. Blood bubbled from his lips as he gasped for breath, his chest heaving shallowly. Lucas dropped the rifle and crawled across the snow to Lily, scooping her up into his arms. Tears streamed down his cheeks, freezing against his skin. "I've got you, baby," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Daddy's here. Daddy's got you." Behind him, Shadow struggled to his feet with a low, pained growl. Blood poured from his wound, steaming in the frigid air. His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest heaving with effort. He turned his gaze on Jed, who lay twitching in the snow, blood spreading around him in a steaming pool. Shadow snarled a deep rumbling sound that vibrated in his chest and echoed through the clearing. His ears pinned back against his skull, his lips peeling back from his teeth in a savage snarl. Then he moved. He limped forward each step, sending fresh sprays of blood across the snow. But he didn't slow. His bad leg dragged uselessly behind him, his body trembling with exhaustion and pain. But his eyes burned bright and furious in the darkness. Jed's eyes widened in terror as the dog loomed over him. He tried to raise his good arm in defense, but Shadow's jaws closed around his throat in a single savage bite. The man's scream was cut off instantly, replaced by a wet, gurgling choke as blood sprayed from his neck in thick, dark jets. Shadow snarled and shook his head violently, his teeth tearing through flesh and muscle. Blood sprayed across his muzzle, staining his fur dark and steaming. He shook again, ripping sideways, and the man's body jerked once, then went limp. For a long moment, the only sound was Shadow's ragged breathing as he stood over the dead man, blood dripping from his muzzle onto the snow. His tail stood stiff and quivering behind him, his ears pinned flat against his skull. His chest heaved with each labored breath, blood pouring steadily from the gunshot wound in his ribs. Then his legs buckled. He collapsed into the snow with a low, broken whine. His eyes rolled back in his head, and for a moment Lucas thought he was gone. "Shadow," he screamed, his voice breaking. He set Lily down gently in the snow and crawled to the dog's side, gathering his massive head into his lap. Blood smeared across his jeans, steaming in the frigid air. Shadow's eyes fluttered open, dull and glazed with pain. His tail twitched weakly once against the snow. He turned his head slightly, his gaze finding Lily where she lay, curled in the snow, her eyes half open, lips trembling with silent whimpers. A low, shuddering whine rose in his chest, vibrating against Lucas's thighs. He pushed his nose against her knee, smearing blood across her pink fleece pants. His eyes fluttered again, his breathing shallow and ragged. Lucas pressed his forehead against Shadow's, tears streaming down his cheeks. His blood mixed with the dog's, dripping steadily onto the snow in dark, steaming droplets. "You did it," he whispered, his voice shaking with grief and gratitude. "You saved her. You saved all of us." Shadow whined softly, his eyes half closing. His breathing slowed, each exhale a thin, trembling sigh. Lucas pressed his hand against the dog's ribs, feeling the weak, fluttering pulse beneath his palm. Behind them, the forest fell silent. The wind died down, leaving only the soft hiss of falling snow settling across the blood-stained ground. The bodies of the two men lay still and silent, their blood steaming in the cold. Lucas gathered Shadow's massive head into his lap, cradling it gently, as the dog's breathing slowed to a thin, trembling rasp. His chest heaved once, twice, then fell still. For a long moment, Lucas sat there in the falling snow, cradling the dog's head against his chest, sobbing silently as Lily whimpered softly beside him. Then he drew a ragged breath, wiped the tears from his eyes with shaking fingers, and gathered his daughter into his arms once more. Shadow lay still at his feet, his fur already dusted with a thin layer of falling snow. "Thank you, Lucas," whispered his voice breaking. "Thank you, boy. Rest now. You've earned it." He stood cradling Lily against his chest and turned toward the dark line of trees beyond the clearing. Snow fell around them in silent, endless waves, erasing footprints and bloodstains alike. And behind him, in the silent clearing under the black winter sky, the greatest warrior he had ever known lay at peace, his final mission complete. Red and blue strobes pulsed across the snow-shrouded clearing, cutting through the darkness in rhythmic flashes. The wail of sirens echoed through the forest, winding down as emergency vehicles crunched to a stop along the narrow trailhead. Lucas knelt in the snow, cradling Lily against his chest with his good arm. His injured shoulder burned with white-hot agony, blood soaking through the shredded fabric of his jacket, steaming in the icy air. His breaths came in ragged gasps, each inhalation sharp with the metallic taste of blood and fear. He rocked Lily gently back and forth, whispering broken words against her hair. Shadow lay half-sprawled across his lap, his massive head resting on Lucas's thigh. Blood pooled around his ribs, staining the snow black in the dim emergency lights. His chest rose and fell in shallow, rattling breaths, each exhale ending in a weak, trembling whine. "Hold on, boy." Lucas rasped, tears freezing on his lashes. He cupped Shadow's blood-slicked muzzle in his trembling hand, his thumb stroking over the thick fur between his eyes. "Hold on. You're okay. You're okay." Shadow's ears twitched weakly at his voice. His tail thumped once against the ground, a feeble gesture that sent a fresh surge of grief through Lucas's chest. "Don't you dare give up on me," he whispered, choking on a sob. "Don't you dare leave us. Not now." The forest erupted with movement as EMTs poured from the ambulance, their boots crunching across the crusted drifts. Flashlight beams flickered through the trees, illuminating the still forms of the two dead men sprawled across the snow, their blood steaming into the frigid night. A sheriff's deputy approached cautiously, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. "Mr. Parker," he called out, his voice edged with cautious urgency. "Are you injured? Do you have any weapons?" Lucas didn't look up. He couldn't tear his eyes away from Shadow's face. The dog's breathing hitched his ribs, stuttering with each shallow gasp. Blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth, dripping in slow, rhythmic droplets onto the snow. "Help him," Lucas croaked, his voice breaking. Tears spilled down his cheeks, splashing onto Shadow's muzzle. "Please, help him." "Medic," the deputy shouted, waving the EMTs forward. Two paramedics knelt beside Lucas in the snow, their breath steaming in short bursts. One, a tall woman with copper hair tied back in a tight braid, pressed gloved fingers against Lucas's shoulder wound, checking the bleeding. He flinched, gasping as fresh pain tore through him. "You're going to be okay," she said, her voice calm and professional. She turned her head, shouting over her shoulder. "We need a trauma kit over here, Stat." The second medic, a broad-shouldered man with dark skin and eyes filled with quiet determination, focused on Shadow. He pressed his fingers lightly around the bullet wound in the dog's side, wincing at the hot gush of blood that welled up around his glove. "He's lost a lot of blood," he said, his voice low and grave. "We need to move him now." Lucas shook his head violently, his vision swimming with tears. "He can't die," he whispered. Please don't let him die." Shadow shifted weakly at the sound of his voice. His eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. A low whine rose in his chest, barely audible over the wailing wind and crackle of radios around them. "He's fighting," the medic said quietly, his fingers working quickly to pack gauze around the wound. "He's still fighting." Sheriff's deputies moved around them, sweeping the clearing for threats. One of them kicked aside the rifle dropped by the scarred man and knelt beside Jed's limp form. The thick man groaned weakly, blood bubbling from his lips as he struggled to draw breath. "He's alive," the deputy called out. "We've got a live one here." Another deputy approached, cuffs in hand. Without ceremony, he rolled Jed onto his stomach and yanked his arms behind his back, locking the cuffs around his wrists with a sharp metallic snap. The man let out a choked whimper, his body trembling with shock and blood loss. "Get him out of here," the sheriff ordered, stepping into the clearing with snow crunching under his boots. He swept his flashlight across the scene, his eyes tightening with grim recognition as they landed on Lucas and Lily. "God Almighty," he murmured. Get a stretcher over here. EMTs rushed forward, unfolding a collapsible canvas stretcher. The copper-haired medic pressed a fresh bandage against Lucas's shoulder, blood seeping instantly through the white gauze. "We need to get him to the ambulance," she said to her partner. "His BP is dropping. I'm not leaving him." Lucas gasped, his voice breaking as tears spilled down his cheeks. He pressed his forehead against Shadow's, feeling the dog's weak, fluttering breaths against his skin. "I'm not leaving him. Please." The broad-shouldered medic met his eyes, his own gaze filled with quiet empathy. "We won't leave him," he promised. "We're taking him too." Another medic stepped forward with a second stretcher, this one reinforced with thick webbing and steel braces. She knelt beside Shadow, slipping an oxygen mask gently over his muzzle. His ears twitched at the touch, his eyes flickering open. The medic stroked his head softly, whispering reassurances as her partner slid a lifting sheet under his massive frame. Lucas watched through tears as they worked. Every breath Shadow took was a shallow, rattling gasp, his ribs barely lifting beneath the blood-matted fur. His tail twitched once feebly before falling still again. "Don't leave me," Lucas whispered, his voice trembling. His tears fell faster, dripping onto Shadow's muzzle and mixing with the blood smeared across his fur. "Don't leave me, boy. Don't leave Lily. Please." Shadow's eyes flickered open again, dull and glassy. He turned his head slightly toward Lucas, his ears twitching weakly at the sound of his voice. A low, trembling whine rose in his chest, fading quickly into silence. "Ready to lift," the medic said softly. They gathered around the stretcher, 4 EMTs gripping the reinforced handles. On the count of 3, they lifted Shadow's limp body from the snow. Blood dripped steadily from the soaked bandages around his ribs, leaving a dark, steaming trail across the ground as they carried him toward the waiting ambulance. Lucas sobbed silently, clutching Lily tighter against his chest. The copper-haired medic pressed her hand gently against his back, guiding him toward the second stretcher. "We need to get you to the hospital," she said softly. "You're losing blood." "I can't leave him," Lucas rasped. His legs trembled beneath him, his vision swimming with darkness and light. I can't leave him." "You won't," she promised. "He's coming with us." 2 deputies moved forward, taking Lily gently from his arms. She whimpered softly, her eyes half open, lips trembling with silent cries. Lucas reached for her, his blood-slicked fingers brushing against her cheek. "Daddy's right behind you, Bug," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Daddy's coming. I promise." They laid her on a pediatric stretcher, wrapping her in silver emergency blankets. Her eyes closed as the warmth surrounded her small, trembling body. EMTs strapped oxygen over her nose and lifted her gently into the second ambulance. Lucas turned his gaze back to Shadow. The dog lay still on the stretcher, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rattling breaths. His eyes were closed, his ears flicking weakly with each labored inhale. Blood dripped steadily from the bandages wrapped around his ribs, staining the canvas beneath him, dark and steaming in the frigid night. "Don't leave us," Lucas whispered, tears streaming down his cheeks. He reached out a trembling hand, brushing his fingers over Shadow's muzzle. "Please, boy, don't leave us. Don't leave me and Lily. I need you. I need you." Shadow's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. For a brief moment, his eyes flickered open, dull and glazed with pain. His tail moved once, a weak, trembling wag that barely stirred the blood-soaked blanket beneath him. Then his chest hitched, and his breathing stuttered into a shallow, rattling gasp. "Let's move!" the medic shouted, his voice sharp with urgency. They lifted Shadow onto the ambulance gurney, locking the steel braces into place. The doors swung open, flooding the clearing with warm, yellow light. Lucas watched through tears as they wheeled him inside Shadow's massive head, lolling sideways against the mattress, his breaths growing shallower with each passing second. His vision blurred, his knees buckling as he sank into the snow. "Sir!" the copper-haired medic shouted, catching his arm as darkness closed in around him. "Stay with me. Stay with me." Her voice faded into silence as his vision went black. The fluorescent lights of the emergency surgical wing flickered overhead, casting cold white reflections off sterile linoleum floors. Monitors beeped in quiet, rhythmic pulses behind thick glass doors. Voices murmured in clipped medical jargon from curtained bays lining the hallway. Lucas sat slumped in a molded plastic chair outside Trauma OR3, his shoulders hunched, his chin resting on his chest. His flannel shirt was soaked through with blood, his own and Shadow's stiffening into dark, crusted patches that cracked when he shifted. A thick bandage wrapped around his shoulder, bright white against the dried gore of his clothes, and an IV line snaked down his arm, dripping saline into his bloodstream with mechanical precision. Across his lap lay Lily, curled in a tight ball inside a pediatric hospital blanket. Her cheeks were pale lashes casting shadows across the dark smudges beneath her eyes. Her damp curls stuck to her forehead in unruly clumps. An oxygen cannula looped around her ears, misting softly with each shallow breath. Lucas's good hand rested atop her hair, his thumb stroking small circles against her scalp in a mindless rhythm. His eyes were red-rimmed, bloodshot, distant. Every few seconds he lifted them to the operating room door across from him. Through the reinforced glass panel he saw only chaos. Shadow's massive frame lay sprawled on a stainless steel table, surrounded by blue-gowned surgeons, moving with quick, efficient precision. Bright white surgical lights illuminated the dark fur matted with blood around the gaping wound in his ribs. Machines beeped in frantic discord, their glowing numbers flickering with each shallow pulse of his heart. Lucas swallowed hard, his throat raw from hours of crying and screaming and praying. His pulse throbbed in his injured shoulder pain, radiating down into his chest and across his back like hot iron brands. He forced himself to keep breathing, each inhale rattling through lungs that felt too small to contain the grief and fear expanding inside him. Beside him, Lily stirred. She shifted her head slightly against his thigh, her small fingers curling in the blanket. Her eyelids fluttered open, dazed blue eyes blinking up at the flickering lights overhead. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice hoarse and fragile as crumpled tissue. "Where's Shadow?" Lucas felt something shatter deep in his chest. Tears welled in his eyes again, blurring the surgical room into smears of bright white and bloody darkness. He forced a smile onto his lips, though it trembled and broke almost instantly. "He's here, Bug," he rasped, his voice shaking. He stroked her hair gently, swallowing the sob that threatened to tear out of his throat. "He's right here. He's fighting, just like he always does." Lily blinked up at him, confusion clouding her gaze. Her eyes flicked past his shoulder to the operating room window. The overhead lights glinted off her tear-filled lashes as she watched the shapes moving inside. "Is he hurting?" she whispered. Lucas closed his eyes against the question. A single tear slipped down his cheek, tracing a hot line through the grime and dried blood on his face. "He's brave," he whispered back. His voice cracked and broke. "He's so brave, baby girl." Inside the operating room, Shadow's heart monitor let out a shrill, stuttering beep. One of the surgeons barked an order, voice muffled through the glass. A nurse moved quickly, slamming a syringe of epinephrine into the IV line taped to Shadow's foreleg. His massive chest heaved once, twice, then fell still. The beeping shifted into a steady, screaming whine. "No." Lucas breathed, his vision tunneling as his pulse roared in his ears. "No, no, no, no." The surgeon pressed the paddles to Shadow's chest. The dog's body jerked violently under the jolt of electricity, fur rippling in waves along his flank. The machine beeped again, slow, weak, irregular. Lily whimpered softly against his lap. "Daddy, I'm scared." Lucas tore his gaze away from the glass and looked down at her. His heart clenched at how small she looked in the hospital blanket, her cheeks still smudged with dried blood and dirt. He swallowed the taste of bile rising in his throat and forced his trembling lips into another broken smile. "It's okay, Bug," he whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "It's okay to be scared. I'm scared, too." "Is Shadow dying?" she asked, her voice breaking on the last word. Lucas felt something inside him fracture completely. Tears spilled down his cheeks in silent, shaking rivers. He bent forward until his forehead pressed against hers, their breaths mingling in ragged little gasps. He's fighting Lily," he whispered, his voice shaking so badly he could barely form the words. "He's fighting with everything he's got." She sniffled softly, her tears wetting his chin. Her small fingers clutched at his flannel shirt, curling into the blood-soaked fabric over his heart. "I want him to come home," she sobbed. Lucas closed his eyes. The pain in his chest radiated outward, pulsing through his ribs and down his spine until every inch of him burned with it. His shoulder throbbed in time with his pulse, a hot, searing agony that blurred the edges of his vision. "I know, baby," he whispered. "I know." Inside the operating room, the surgical team worked in frantic silence. Blood pooled in stainless steel basins, dark and steaming in the sterile cold of the OR. Suction tubes hummed quietly as they pulled dark clots from the wound. The lead surgeon's brow was furrowed in fierce concentration, sweat beading along his hairline beneath the surgical cap. "Come on, soldier," he muttered under his breath, his gloved fingers moving with deft, precise speed. "Stay with me. Don't you give up now." Lucas squeezed Lily tighter against his chest. His tears dripped onto the top of her head, disappearing into her tangled curls. "God," he whispered, his voice cracking into silent sobs. Please don't take him. Please. He saved her. He saved me. Please don't take him." The monitors in the OR beeped again, slow stuttering, but there. The surgeon let out a short, sharp sigh and nodded to the nurse beside him. "He's stabilizing," the nurse said, her voice calm and clipped as she adjusted the IV drips. "Pressure is holding. Heart rate is climbing. 42, 46, 51. The surgeon didn't look up from his work. "Get ready to close," he said softly. Lucas let out a shaking, broken breath. His forehead dropped to Lily's hair, his shoulders trembling with sobs he couldn't suppress. She curled into him, pressing her face against his chest, her small hands gripping his shirt with desperate strength. In the silence that followed, broken only by the rhythmic beep of Shadow's heart monitor, a single thought rose in Lucas's mind, clear and sharp and aching. "Có những anh hùng không cần huân chương, chỉ cần một trái tim không bao giờ bỏ cuộc." There are heroes who need no medals, only a heart that never surrenders. Shadow had always been that hero. Not just a dog, not just a soldier, but a protector, a guardian, a friend, a son. The last piece of Sarah he still had left. The unspoken promise between man and beast that no darkness would ever consume them as long as they stood together. His tears dripped onto Lily's curls as the words burned through his chest, branding themselves into his soul. He would never forget them. And he would make sure Lily never did either. Because heroes like Shadow weren't born. They were forged. In war, in pain, in loyalty so fierce it burned brighter than any fear. And as the surgeon placed the final sutures and covered Shadow's wound with fresh bandages, as the monitor steadied into a quiet, steady rhythm, Lucas raised his head and pressed his lips to the top of Lily's hair. "He's coming home, Bug," he whispered, his voice shaking with grief and relief and wonder. "Shadow's coming home." She sniffled softly against his chest. "Promise." His tears fell faster, blurring the white hallway into golden smears of light and shadow. "I promise," he whispered. "I promise." The ICU ward was quiet, except for the soft, steady beeping of monitors and the muted hum of ventilation systems overhead. Dim yellow light pooled along the tiled floor, illuminating rows of kennels and rolling carts lined with IV bags and oxygen tanks. A faint antiseptic smell lingered beneath the scent of wet fur and disinfected stainless steel. Lucas sat hunched on a narrow vinyl chair against the far wall. His left shoulder was wrapped in thick gauze, the white bandage stained rust red where blood had seeped through. A thin hospital blanket draped over his slumped shoulders. His hair was matted with sweat and melted snow. Dark strands curling against his forehead. Dried blood formed a thin crust along his jawline, flaking onto his chest each time he moved. Beside him, curled under his uninjured arm, was Lily. Her small hand lay pressed against his chest, her pink-casted fingers twitching faintly in sleep. Dark bruises circled her eyes like smudged ink, but her breaths came slow and even fluttering, the thin oxygen cannula looped beneath her nose. They both faced the glass kennel in front of them. Inside, Shadow lay stretched across a thick fleece pad, his massive head resting on folded paws. A tangle of IV lines snaked from his shaved foreleg into hanging bags of saline and plasma. Tubes connected him to the oxygen flow curling in white clouds beneath his chin. His bandaged side rose and fell in shallow labored breaths, each movement rippling faint tremors across his flanks. Fresh sutures traced jagged black stitches across the wound near his ribs, still seeping thin lines of diluted blood beneath the dressing. For hours he hadn't moved. Lucas stared at him, without blinking. His vision blurred with exhaustion and tears that no longer fell. Each time Shadow's chest paused before the next rise, his own heart seized with fresh terror. "Please," he thought, gripping Lily tighter against him. "Please, boy. You can't leave us. Not after everything. Please." A quiet knock echoed from the glass door behind them. Dr. Evelyn Hale entered, her long navy scrubs rustling softly. She carried a clipboard in one hand and pressed the other to Lucas's uninjured shoulder with gentle pressure. "How are you holding up?" she asked in a low, husky voice. Lucas swallowed against the burning lump in his throat. "He hasn't moved," he rasped, his voice breaking. "I don't know if—" Dr. Hale crouched beside him, her dark eyes soft with a warmth that eased the trembling in his chest. She turned to study Shadow through the glass, watching the steady flicker of green across the monitor above his kennel. "He's holding on," she said quietly. "His vitals are stable. Blood pressure's low but climbing. Heart rate's weak but consistent. And," she smiled faintly, lines creasing at the corners of her eyes, "his brain activity's normalizing. There's no sign of cognitive decline. He's resting, healing." Lucas let out a shuddering exhale, his shoulders slumping forward with sudden bone-deep relief. He bent his head, pressing his lips to the top of Lily's hair. She stirred faintly, her lashes fluttering, but she didn't wake. Dr. Hale rose and set her clipboard aside, pushing the kennel door open with a soft click. She stepped inside, her sneakers silent on the rubber matting, and knelt beside Shadow's head. She slipped a gloved hand under his jaw fingers, pressing lightly along the tendons of his throat. Her thumb stroked the short, coarse fur along his cheekbone. "Hey, soldier," she murmured, her voice warm and low. "You can wake up now." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Shadow's ear twitched. It was a tiny movement, barely visible against the bandages and drips tangled around him. But Lucas felt it like a lightning bolt through his chest. His breath caught ragged and trembling. Tears welled fresh and hot in his eyes. "Come on, boy," Dr. Hale whispered. Her thumb pressed more firmly against his cheek. "They're here. Your family's here." Shadow's eyelids fluttered once, twice. His breathing hitched, a faint whine rising in his chest before fading into silence again. Then slowly, painfully, his eyes cracked open. Warm amber met Lucas's glassy blue from across the kennel. Dull at first, the gaze slowly sharpened as his pupils dilated, adjusting to the dim light. His ears twitched again, this time toward Lucas's voice as he choked out a sob. "Hey there, Shadow." "Lucas," whispered, his voice breaking completely. Tears streamed down his cheeks, dripping onto Lily's tangled curls. His uninjured hand pressed flat to the glass. "Hey, buddy. We're right here." Shadow's eyes tracked the movement, his gaze locking onto Lucas's face with heavy, blinking focus. His tail moved once against the fleece pad. A single slow wag that rattled the metal side of the kennel with a dull thump before falling still. "Daddy," Lily mumbled, stirring in his arms. Her lashes lifted sluggishly, her blue eyes cloudy with sleep. She blinked at Shadow through the glass. "Shadow, awake." Lucas pressed his lips to her temple, his tears wetting her cold skin. "Yeah, Bug," he whispered, voice trembling. "Yeah. He's awake." Dr. Hale scratched Shadow gently behind his ears. He whined again, softer this time, his breathing growing ragged with relief. His eyes fluttered closed for a moment before blinking back open, his gaze flicking between Lucas and Lily. "He's a fighter," Dr. Hale said, softly looking back over her shoulder at them. Her eyes glistened in the dim light. "His vitals are improving by the minute. He's got a long road ahead. But," she smiled faintly, a wistful, tired smile edged with awe, "he has a reason to keep fighting." Lucas sobbed silently, his shoulders shaking. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass, his tears leaving cloudy smears across the transparent barrier. Lily shifted in his lap, stretching out her small hand to press it flat against the window. Her fingers spread wide, palm cupping the cool surface as if trying to reach through it. "Shadow, good boy," she whispered, her voice thin and shaking. Shadow's gaze flicked to her hand. His nose twitched weakly, his whiskers quivering against the oxygen mask strapped over his muzzle. His tail wagged again, slower, weaker, but it moved. For a few moments, time froze around them. Lucas felt every beat of his aching heart, each pulse echoing in his chest like distant thunder. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled his nose. The beeping monitors blurred into a soft, rhythmic lullaby. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, bathing Shadow's battered frame in a cold, golden glow that haloed the frost-colored fur along his chest. He wasn't dead. He was here, alive, breathing, looking at them with those dark amber eyes filled with pain and exhaustion, and something deeper, something fierce and stubborn and unbreakable. Love. Lucas pressed his lips to Lily's hair, closing his eyes against the tears that refused to stop falling. His throat burned with grief and relief, tangled together in a knot so tight it felt like it would split him open. "Thank you," he whispered, voice cracking into broken syllables. "Thank you, boy, for staying." Dr. Hale rose, gently adjusting the flow of Shadow's IV drip. She glanced back at them, her smile sad and beautiful. "Dogs like him," she said softly, her voice carrying through the quiet hum of the ward. "They don't live for themselves. They live for the people they love, for the families who need them, for the children who trust them." She reached down, brushing her gloved fingers over Shadow's thick fur one last time. "He has a reason to live," she whispered, "and that's stronger than any medicine I could ever give him." Outside the ICU, dawn was breaking over the Colorado mountains. Pale golden light crept across the snow-covered peaks, melting the blackness of night into a haze of lavender and rose. Somewhere beyond those glass walls, life moved on. Cars hissed along iced highways, engines rumbled to life, pine trees creaked under the weight of fresh snow. But in that quiet ICU ward, bathed in sterile light and the trembling hope of a family who had lost too much already, one heart kept beating against all odds. A soldier's heart, a protector's heart, the heart of a dog who refused to leave the child he loved more than life itself. Shadow's tail thumped once more against the fleece pad. Slow, weak, but there, alive, fighting, staying, and in that moment, Lucas knew with absolute certainty that no matter what the future held, no matter how long or painful the road ahead might be, they would walk it together, man-child and dog, bound by a loyalty deeper than blood, by a love stronger than death, by a promise that heroes don't always need medals. Sometimes all they need is a heart that never surrenders. 6 months later, the Colorado sun rose warm and golden over the foothills, melting the lingering patches of spring snow into glittering rivulets along the packed gravel drive. A faded wooden sign swayed gently in the morning breeze above the gate, freshly painted letters, catching the early light. Valor Canine Rescue and Veteran Therapy Center. The main building sprawled low across the crest of the ridge pine siding, gleaming with oil stain, wide windows flung open to let in the crisp mountain air. Rows of kennels lined the side yard, each enclosed in chain-link fencing beneath pitched metal roofs. The scent of pine resin and fresh cedar mulch filled the wide training yard beyond, mingling with the sharper tang of dog shampoo and cut grass. Lucas stood just inside the main paddock, hands on his hips, watching with quiet pride as his trainees moved through their morning drills. The crisp, barked commands of volunteer handlers echoed across the clearing, mingling with the rhythmic clatter of agility gates and the rattle of metal food bowls being stacked along the fence. His left shoulder still ached when rain rolled in off the plains, the scar tissue puckered in tight beneath the faded cotton of his t-shirt. But he welcomed the pain. It reminded him of what had been lost and what had been saved. A high-pitched giggle rang out across the yard, cutting through the deeper rumble of commands and barks. "Shadow, good boy, Shadow." Lily stood barefoot in the dewy grass, her little denim overalls soaked to the knees, curls bouncing around her shoulders in golden tangles. Her cheeks were pink with laughter as she watched Shadow limp in slow circles around a group of puppies, tumbling over each other in the training pen. Shadow moved with a measured dignity that belied his limp. His hind leg dragged slightly with each step, the muscle atrophied beneath the thick scar running along his hip. But his chest remained broad and proud, his ears pinned forward with quiet focus as he watched the young dogs wrestle, sniff, and bark at each other. "Easy, rookies," Lucas called out, smiling, as Shadow nudged a black lab puppy back onto its paws after it tripped over its own ears. "Listen to your sergeant." Shadow paused, lifting his massive head to look at Lucas. Their eyes met amber and steel blue, and for a moment everything around them fell away. 6 months ago, Shadow had lain broken and bleeding on a sterile table, his chest barely rising beneath the surgeon's trembling hands. 6 months ago, Lucas had knelt in melted snow, cradling his lifeless body, begging him to stay. And now he was here, alive, breathing, teaching, a survivor among survivors. Shadow turned back to the puppies, his tail wagging once a slow, sweeping arc that sent them scrambling to follow him. He moved with a quiet authority, correcting them with gentle nudges, growls, and soft barks. Each time he paused to let his bad leg rest, the pups clustered around him, licking his muzzle and pawing at his shoulders. He tolerated their affection with the stoic grace of an old general humoring his cadets. Lily clapped her hands in delight, running across the yard to throw her arms around Shadow's neck. He lowered his massive head with infinite gentleness, nuzzling her chest and flicking his ears back with quiet joy. She pressed her cheek against his fur, giggling as his whiskers tickled her jaw. "You're the best boy in the whole world," she whispered into his ear. "The bestest hero ever." Lucas felt his throat tighten. Tears burned behind his eyes as he watched them. His little girl with her arms around the dog who had saved her life, both of them whole again, beneath the golden dawn. Behind him, a group of veterans emerged from the therapy wing. Men and women in worn jeans and faded caps, their gaits stiff with old injuries, eyes shadowed with memories that clung like smoke. They paused along the paddock fence, leaning against the rails, as they watched Shadow move among the puppies. "He's something else," one man said, his voice rough with awe. "That dog. He knows. He knows what we've seen," another murmured. "What we've lost." Lucas turned to face them, smiling faintly. "Yeah," he said softly. "He knows. And he never gave up on me. I think he won't give up on any of us." They stood in silence for a while, listening to Lily's laughter and the soft whines of the puppies tumbling around Shadow's feet. A warm breeze rolled down from the ridge, stirring the pine needles overhead. Somewhere high above, a hawk wheeled in slow, silent circles against the pale blue sky. Shadow limped towards the fence, leaving the puppies to wrestle in the grass. He pressed his nose against one man's trembling hand, breathing him in, reading the sadness and pain that lingered under his skin. The man bent his head, tears slipping from his lashes as he stroked the thick fur along Shadow's scarred shoulder. "Thank you," he whispered hoarsely. "Thank you, old boy." Shadow licked the tears from his fingers, his ears flicking back in quiet understanding. His tail thumped once against the grass, slow and steady. Lucas watched them, his chest aching with something too big for words. The wind stirred his hair, carrying with it the scent of pine and sun-warmed grass, of wet dog and dust, of blood and tears and healing. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing it in. When he opened them again, Shadow was standing beside Lily, his massive head resting against her tiny shoulder as she giggled and buried her face in his fur. The puppies tumbled around them in chaotic joy, the veterans watching with quiet, broken smiles that carried a flicker of hope. And in that moment, beneath the golden Colorado sunrise, Lucas knew the truth he had been searching for since the day he left the battlefield behind. Healing doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from choosing to keep loving anyway. And sometimes it comes on 4 legs, with eyes that have seen war, and a heart that never stopped fighting for peace. The summer night spread wide and endless above the Colorado hills, a velvet canvas strewn with a billion burning stars. The Milky Way spilled across the darkness in a hazy river of silver and ghost light glowing with ancient promises no human tongue could name. In the open yard behind the small timber cabin, Shadow lay curled on the soft grass, his massive frame rising and falling in slow, rhythmic breaths. His fur rippled faintly with each breeze drifting down from the pine-covered slopes, the faint scent of wild mint and warm stone clinging to the night air. Curled along his broad back like a kitten resting atop a sleeping lion, lay Lily. Her tiny arms were draped across his shoulders, her cheek nestled into the thick scruff at the base of his neck. The hem of her cotton nightgown fluttered gently with each exhale from Shadow's chest. She slept deeply, her breath a quiet whisper that rose and fell with the steady rhythm of his body beneath her. The silver glow of the moon caught in her curls, turning them pale gold as they spilled across Shadow's ribs. One of her bare feet pressed lightly against the ground, toes curled into the cool grass. The other rested against Shadow's flank, rising and falling with each silent heartbeat beneath her skin. From the wooden porch a few yards away, Lucas watched them. His elbows rested on his knees, the veins in his forearms casting long shadows in the golden pool of light spilling from the cabin's open doorway. A single lamp burned inside, throwing faint flickers across the worn floorboards and the simple framed photos lining the walls. His eyes were damp and the glow lashes casting dark crescents against his cheekbones. A half-empty coffee mug sat cooling on the step beside him, the steam long since faded into the chill mountain breeze. He leaned forward, bracing his forearms against his thighs, and stared at the 2 most precious lives he'd ever known. His chest ached with a quiet, bone-deep gratitude so fierce it felt like it might split him open. Shadow shifted in the grass, curling his paws beneath his chest, with infinite care to avoid waking Lily. His ears flicked forward and back, attuned to every small rustle of the world around them, the night wind threading through the dry switchgrass, the distant call of an owl hunting in the cottonwoods along the creek bed, the soft creak of pine boughs shifting high above in the darkness. Lucas drew a slow breath, the crisp air filling his lungs with the scent of sage and pine and summer grass. He let it out in a quiet exhale, the sound barely louder than the whisper of the wind across the fields. "Thank you," he murmured into the darkness, his voice rough with unshed tears. He swallowed hard, feeling the words scrape up from somewhere deep and hidden inside him. "Thank you, warrior. For coming home. For staying. For saving her. And saving me too." Shadow's ears twitched at his voice, the only sign that he'd heard. His eyes remained half-closed, pupils dilated wide to drink in the faint starlight shimmering down from above. A gentle breeze rippled across the yard, ruffling the tall grass around them, carrying the warmth of the cabin lights out into the wide darkness. Lucas leaned back against the porch post, the rough timber warm against his spine. He tilted his head to look up at the endless sweep of stars overhead, each one burning with a quiet, impossible eternity. On the grass, Shadow blinked slowly, his dark amber eyes reflecting the fractured gleam of constellations scattered across the sky. His gaze lingered there, unblinking, as if reading messages written long before men learned to speak silent oaths and ancient truths known only to those who stood watch through the night. He drew a slow, deep breath, his broad chest expanding beneath Lily's sleeping weight. The fur along his flanks lifted with the exhale rustling against the grass, in a sound like shifting silk. For a moment his gaze shifted to the girl curled atop him, his pupils contracting to thin slits of dark devotion. Then he turned his eyes back to the sky, watching the silent dance of the stars, above the wind combing gently through his fur, carrying away the last traces of pain and fear. The faintest flicker of movement stirred in his tail, a quiet thump against the ground. His ears twitched forward again, and though his body remained still, His eyes burned with a fierce, eternal promise written in amber and shadow and starfire. As long as I breathe, you are safe. Above him, the heavens turned in their silent wheel. The Milky Way burned on bright and unbroken, casting its silver glow across the small shape of the child sleeping on the back of her silent guardian. Lucas closed his eyes against the tears rising again. He pressed his palms together, resting them against his forehead in a silent prayer. The words formed without thought, pure and instinctive. Thank you for coming back, for staying, for loving us enough to fight until the end and beyond. The breeze swept softly across the yard, bending the grass in shimmering waves around Shadow's sleeping form. His eyes blinked slowly, lids heavy, his breath warm against Lily's bare ankle. And under the boundless Colorado sky filled with quiet stars and the cool hush of midnight wind, the old warrior closed his eyes at last, knowing his vigil was far from over, because some guardians do not stop watching. Some promises are never broken, and some heroes never truly leave the ones they love. Fade out.